On September 24th, 2019, we were advised of this crime by Larry Paul McClure.
Here at the scene, we discovered a path leading to some disturbed ground that looks a lot like a shallow grave.
We did respond to the residence where the crime occurred, and the victim's remains were found on the property.
On February 4th, 2019, John Thomas McGuire traveled state lines with his girlfriend, Amanda McClure, to meet her family in Skygusty. He had also informed his family that he would later visit their mother, Karen Smith, who lived in Alabama. However, John never arrived in Alabama and refused to call his family even while he kept posting on his Facebook page. What exactly had occurred during this trip? Would John McGuire live to tell his story? Welcome to the M7 Crime Storytime channel, where we cover intriguing and twisted cases across the world. Skygusty is a city in McDowell County, located in the southernmost area of West Virginia, United States. The total city population for Skygusty is about 4,000 people, according to the 2020 census. The rate of violent crimes in the entire county is 427 per 100,000 people, as recorded in 2021. With these figures, the county's crime rate is 78% higher than the national average, which makes it one of the most unsafe communities in the United States. The story of John McGuire and the McClures will further contribute to these numbers, with the case so twisted that law enforcement will resort to laws that haven't been used for ages. John Thomas McGuire was born in 1981 and lived in Minnesota with his family. He had two daughters, Justice and Genesis, as well as a son, Jacob, with ex-partner Angela Erickson. After they broke up, the former couple were able to co-parent their three kids together. Despite John's shortcomings, Angela and the kids describe him as someone whose heart was always in the right place, even when he sometimes made bad decisions. He loved his children very much, although his substance addiction sometimes made him problematic. Things took a turn for the worse when John began dating a deeply troubled woman, Amanda McClure, in 2018. Amanda's mother is unknown, but she and her sister, Anna Chowdhury, were removed from her father's custody in 1988 after he was arrested and charged with first-degree sexual assault on a family member. She was thereafter adopted by Alan and Gwen Holm. Unfortunately, her life still went down a crooked path as she became addicted to drugs, especially methamphetamine. During their relationship, John and Amanda had a son, although his details remain unpublished as he's still a minor. John's relationship with Amanda led him to more problems with drug use. Despite his deep love for her, Amanda loved drugs more. This unbridled addiction would lead to untold horrors. Addiction to drugs always has a strong grip on its victims. John and Amanda were not exempt as they spent all their money trying to buy drugs. For John, his addiction wasn't as far gone as Amanda's, and for the most part, he had a somewhat sensible grip on his reality. However, Amanda was deep into the addiction and couldn't go more than a few hours without getting high. They used all their money and some more to procure these hard substances. Things became even more difficult for the couple in the beginning of 2019 when both of them couldn't pay the rent on their apartment and they were evicted by the landlord. Desperate for some cash, Amanda then made a strange decision to return to her biological father, Larry McClure, whom she'd not kept in touch with for years due to his criminal past. In July 1988, Larry was convicted of first-degree sexual assault of a family member between the ages of 6 and 12. The name of this victim wasn't included in public documents in order to protect the minor's identity. Interestingly, Larry's two daughters, Amanda and Anna, were aged 9 and 12 at the time. This raises suspicion that one or both of them might have also been his victims. Following his conviction, the girls were separately adopted and became estranged from their father. Surprisingly, the trio reunited shortly after his release, despite the bitter past. The plan for Amanda was to travel from Minnesota to West Virginia to seek funds from her father, Larry. She and John also planned to live with them to save money on rent. This was suspicious, as Larry had only recently gotten out of prison on parole in that same February of 2019 after spending 17 and a half years behind bars for child molestation. John and Amanda embarked on the journey in the early days of February 2019. Unfortunately, their car broke down in Indiana, and they had to call Larry to come pick them up. Larry was joined by Amanda's sister, Anna Chowdhury. Anna lived in North Carolina at the time, but quickly reconnected with her father after his release from prison. The four continued in their journey and arrived at Larry's property in Skygusty on February 4th, 2019. All four were drug addicts and immediately began to cook for consumption when they arrived home. John had told his children's mother, Angela, and his kids that he was heading to see his mother, Karen Smith, who lived in Alabama. However, he never made it there as scheduled. The last they heard from him was on February the 18th, 2019. Posts continued showing up on his Facebook page, and his security checks were also being cashed. However, when the Mother's Day celebrations passed on March 31st, 2019, and he didn't contact Angela or his own mother, Karen, like he usually would, his family started getting alarmed. They also tried to reach him for several weeks after, but all efforts proved futile. This led his family to file a missing persons report in June 2019 with the hopes that he'd call as soon as he saw that they were deeply worried. The family also took to social media to publicize the fact that he was missing. However, no one had a clue of where John was. He hadn't contacted friends, and there were no sightings by anyone. The truth about John's whereabouts would not come out until several months after his disappearance. In March 2019, Amanda, Anna, and Larry moved to Tazewell County in the neighboring state of Virginia. However, John didn't follow in the journey. Part of Larry's parole conditions was that he was required to register as a sex offender anytime he moved to a new state. 6 months after moving to the new state, in September 2019, police visited Larry and questioned him over his failure to register as a sex offender. However, the officer got more information than he bargained for. Perhaps because Larry was under the influence of drugs, he suddenly began to tell the police about a crime unrelated to what he was being questioned about. He told the police about a murder he'd committed with his 2 daughters, Amanda and Anna. He specifically directed police to a Skygusty property where the body of their victim was buried. As police officers searched around the Skygusty residence on September 24, 2019, they came across a shallow grave. There, they discovered the badly mutilated body of a man.
We were advised of this crime by Larry Paul McClure. We did respond to the residence where the crime occurred, and the victim's remains were found on the property.
With further forensic investigation carried out, it was discovered that the remains belonged to John McGuire, whose family had reported him missing 3 months prior. A thorough investigation began on the case, and Amanda and Anna didn't deny the facts confessed by their father. On October 3, 2019, both women were charged for concealment of a deceased human body. While in custody for refusal to register as a sex offender, Larry decided to confess the exact details of the crime. He claimed he did this to not waste any more time or taxpayers' money with the investigation. In the letter addressed to the police and dated November 4, 2019, Larry said that after picking up Amanda and John on February 4, 2019, they went to a Skygusty property where they mostly spent time cooking. In the first few 10 days, things were going well in their paradise. However, on Valentine's Day, Amanda told them she wanted to kill John, but didn't state the reason. Larry emphasized in his confession that Amanda was the mastermind behind the whole attack and suggested she might have done it so as to have access to John's social security checks. He also stated in the letter that he was willing to plead guilty or no contest to the crime. "I'm asking for this to be over and not wasting the taxpayers' money and hurting the family members on both sides of this, John McGuire's family and my family," he wrote in the letter. To hatch their plan, the 2 siblings and their father lured John into a trust game. The fact that he trusted Amanda and her deranged family was John's undoing. Amanda had claimed that she could escape any kind of bond and would show her spectators. Interestingly, Amanda was not tied up for the game. Instead, she made John go first and tied him up. After he was tied up, John tried to demonstrate how he could free himself and bent down to untie the ropes. With the back of his head exposed, Amanda quickly smashed a bottle of wine they'd been drinking on his head. Dazed, John stumbled around holding his head as blood gushed out. The family of 3 then hogtied the injured man to ensure that he couldn't defend himself, despite the fact that he was already bleeding heavily. After successfully restraining him, the family went on a torture spree for another 2 days. With minds fogged with home-cooked, they began to question him, claiming he was a federal agent sent to find out about their lives. They took a bad batch of liquid and injected him 3 times in a bid to kill him. Despite this inhumane treatment, John didn't die. To finish off the evil plan they started, Anna began to strangle John while Larry and Amanda held him down. They also put a plastic bag over his head as Anna choked him to death. Anna's account of these gruesome events deviates from Larry's claim that his daughter orchestrated the idea. According to her, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2019, John confessed his feelings for Amanda to their father, Larry, supposedly in a bid to get his approval. John told Larry of how much he cherished his daughter and how he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. Things began to go downhill from there. According to Anna, Larry was visibly displeased with the confession. After the love confession, Anna claimed that Larry sat down with a grin that she could not properly describe, but scared her nonetheless. From then on, the night got even worse. Anna said that after Amanda had bashed John's head with the bottle, Larry had looked at her and told her to follow his instructions. In fear of her father, she said she had no other choice than to cooperate in the plan to end John's life. She blamed both Amanda and their father for forcing her to eventually strangle John to death. The 3 of them buried John's body in a shallow grave of about 2 feet on the same property. But this wasn't enough for them. Due to Amanda's paranoid fear that John was not really dead, they exhumed John's body 6 days after he was buried and continued to torture him even after his death. Larry put stakes into the body to allay his daughter's fears and confirmed that John had indeed died. They also dismembered the corpse and buried it in 2 different locations that same night because Larry planned on selling the property. While Larry was already in custody, his 2 daughters were arrested in October 2019. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, the trial of the 3 perpetrators was delayed for a period of time. There wasn't much need for investigation, as the perpetrators had already confessed. However, an even more unimaginable twist awaited the detectives with the little digging they did regarding the lives of this newly reunited family. It was discovered that when Larry and his daughters had traveled to Tazewell County in Virginia, they had committed yet another crime. Larry and Amanda had not only engaged in an incestuous relationship, but they'd also united themselves in unholy matrimony. The father and daughter were wedded on March 11, 2019, by a United Methodist Church minister of the gospel. To avoid suspicion of their crime, the incestuous couple didn't provide Larry's true name on the marriage license. Anna was also present as a witness to the union. Reacting to the discovery, Tazewell County Sheriff Brian Hyatt said the marriage of a father and daughter is still very much illegal in Virginia and punishable by up to 6 months in jail. Hyatt also noted that while the crime had been in the books for several years, it had not received much attention because it was such a rare occurrence. With the severity of the already existing crime, it wasn't clear if the father and daughter were charged with incest. However, the murder case went on. The murder trials for the 3 were held separately. Larry kept true to his confessional letter and pled guilty to first-degree murder on July 16, 2020. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in August 2020.
Then I told you I would take the life with mercy plea. Okay, my understanding is that the state never offered you a plea to life with mercy.
No, sir. That was my misunderstanding between me and Missy. Yeah.
Okay, and the plea that was offered to you was to plead guilty to first-degree murder with no recommendation of mercy. With no recommendation at all. On a Thursday morning, you were sitting on your porch, and Amanda came out and said she wanted to kill John.
Correct, sir.
And she needed some things. Rope or tape or something, some other things. And you agreed to help her away from
I've been away from them because I've been in prison, and they've been in adoption.
So y'all agree, and this is all on Thursday still, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, you end up playing this trust game, and John gets tied up.
Yep.
Okay. And before he gets tied up, he and Amanda have a dispute, and Amanda whacks him in the head with this wine bottle.
Across the back of the head, yes, busting the head up.
And his head was bleeding from that. He was kind of adamant.
It was bleeding pretty bad, yeah.
There's hitting and kicking, right? He was hit and kicked by his
No, he wasn't hit or kicked either one, no.
tied up.
He was kept tied up. Amanda took and stood one side of his head, and Anna gave him 2 shots of the liquid meth, 200 cc's in his neck.
Now, was that in the living room or in the
It was
bedroom?
in the bedroom.
Okay, so he had already been
He
taken.
got been moved and tied back up in the bedroom, yes.
Okay, and was this the second day?
This was the last day of it, so I guess we
Okay,
didn't.
so probably,
It was
we're missing
Valentine's Day. There was a black garbage bag, Lowe's contractor's bag wrapped around his head by Amanda. And Anna had the 1-inch tape rope around his neck. She strangled him, and Anna and Amanda took poleaxe and cut him up. In this thing, there'd been 3, and I'm gonna go ahead and say it, I'm sorry for the pincher, there've been 3 drug addicts taken off the street, and 3 drug users. There've been 3 murders taken off the street, that's me and my 2 daughters. And there've been 3 fathers lost in this. She lost her son, and her kids lost their father. I lost my dad during this because of the publicity, and my daughters have lost me. Now, there's nothing that I can do to go back and say, oh, God, I'm sorry. If I could turn back the wheels, it wouldn't happen. I do believe in God. I do believe that everything happens for a reason. And I say if I was to go back to that moment today, that it would not happen. No, I cannot say that. I mean, we got to live in reality of life. I can't go back and take something back that is done happen. But I did. And then the end result of it, I still lost it.
Well, you also made a conscious choice to help your daughters heal.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
During his sentencing, he said he hoped his daughters also got a similar sentence because, according to him, they had become like 2 raging dogs whom he couldn't trust around nothing. During court proceedings, John's mother, Karen, was particularly emotional as she learned how much her son suffered before his death. At some point, she had to leave the courtroom. Speaking at Larry's sentencing, she said to him,
To my God, him and her had never been together because my son told me everything. Every time he slept with a woman, every time he done anything with a woman, I knew when my son shot up, I knew when he done drugs, I knew everything about my son. The night before y'all killed him, he told me, no, I'm not gonna make it home for Valentine's or any other time. I'm gonna be like my 2 daddies. And I said, well, they're dead. He said, I know, Mama. And I said, well, what about your money? He said, where I'm going, I won't need it. And he don't need it because he's in heaven. But I promise you, you and your 2 kids are going straight to hell, wide open. Because y'all are sorry. Sorriest people I ever seen. For you to marry your own daughter, that's low down. Low down as dirt. But I'm going to live to see you or one of your kids die before I leave this earth. God's told me. And I hope you remember how I look and how I talk. Because if I had it my way, I'd have every one of y'all write me a letter every day. I killed your son for at least a year and mail it to me. So y'all won't forget it. Because I don't think y'all even care. I don't think you care about what you've done to me and my grandbaby.
Amanda was also sentenced to 40 years imprisonment at the McDowell County Court after she pleaded guilty to a charge of second-degree murder. During the hearing, Amanda pleaded for forgiveness from the court and McGuire's family. She also appealed to the judge to consider her as a victim of her biological father's abuse. According to her, her adoptive parents, Alan and Gwen Holm, who were also present at the sentencing, had raised her better. Karen, John's mother, also spoke at this hearing. She said the three perpetrators had broken her heart as well as that of John's children. She said, however, she would forgive Amanda because God told her to do so. Anna's sentencing came much later in 2021 after she also pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of John on January 28, 2021. On Wednesday, March 31, 2021, she was sentenced to 40 years in prison like her sister. John's children expressed profound grief and anger in response to their father's murder. Justice, who was 18 years old at the time, lamented that her father would never witness important life moments, such as her graduation and wedding. 16-year-old Jacob also expressed his anger at the mindless killing. He also said he'd been experiencing nightmares since his father's murder. Genesis also accused Larry, Amanda, and Anna of robbing her of precious moments. The young child vowed never to forgive the perpetrators for ruining her life. As the McGuires grapple with making sense of their father's murder, several people are also grappling with certain details in the case. One is the scary and likely possible scenario that Larry had been molesting his daughters from a young age. If this is true, perhaps there is a need for the state to also consider psychological evaluation for the two women whose actions seem to be tied to the traumatic experiences of their childhood.
My name is Carol Dodge, and I am the mother of Angie Dodge, who was brutally murdered in June of 1996. And for 23 years, I've traveled every road there is, turned every stone there is, to find justice for my daughter.
On June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Raye Dodge failed to show up at her workplace. This was unusual, therefore her colleagues, Julie and Tony, decided to pay her a visit to check up on her. Upon arriving at her apartment in Idaho Falls, they were met with an unlocked door and a living room in disarray with empty party cups. They then proceeded to the bedroom where, horrifyingly, they saw Angie lying dead, lying on the floor in her own blood. What followed was an ordeal that lasted 26 years. The police spent over 2 decades looking for the perpetrator of this heinous crime. Who could have murdered Angie in such a gruesome way? Would they ever be found? Idaho Falls is one of the most populous cities in the state of Idaho. The city is popular for its River Walk Trail featuring running and bike trails, art installations, and other fascinating features along several miles of the Snake River. As of the census of 2020, the city's population was 64,000 residents, with a crime rate of 3.47 per 1,000 residents. The economy is mostly agricultural-based, but with several industries and corporate jobs. Angie lived in the Numbered Streets neighborhood, which was the first planned residential area in the city. The community was close-knit, nicely shaded, and mostly peaceful. The idea of such a gruesome murder in the serene town was unthinkable. Angie Raye Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Vancouver, Washington, to Jack and Carol Dodge. As the youngest child, she had 3 older brothers named Brent, Todd, and Roger. Angie grew up to become a bright and intelligent girl who helped tutor fellow students at Idaho Falls High School. After graduating high school with honors in 1995, she proceeded to Idaho State University. As a girl who enjoyed her independence, she left her parents' house at the age of 18 and got her own apartment in the same neighborhood. Despite living apart from her family, she visited them constantly. She also worked at a beauty salon where she earned enough to pay her rent and other bills. With her brilliance and diligent nature, Angie had a very promising future ahead of her, but her big dreams were cut short one fateful June night. On June 12, 1996, Angie paid her mom, Carol, a visit at around 5:15 p.m. They talked through the evening, with Angie giving updates on how she was adjusting to her new life in the new apartment. She told her mom the process was very challenging, but she still loved it. During their chat, Angie confided in her mother that she'd done something stupid, but she didn't want to go into details. Carol gave Angie a big hug and told her she'd always be there when she needed to talk. Before Angie left, she hugged her mother for one last time and told her mother she loved her. This moment will be engraved in Carol's mind as the last time she'd hug her daughter. By the time Angie left her mother's house, it was 10:20 p.m. in the evening. Even though it was dark, she didn't think anything of it, as it was a relatively peaceful neighborhood. The next day, on June 13, 1996, Angie didn't show up to work. This was uncharacteristic of her, as she rarely took days off, and even on the few times she did, she always informed management of her intended absence beforehand. Out of concern, two of her co-workers, Julie and Tony, decided to check up at her home to be sure she was okay. They got to her apartment located at 444 I Street, Idaho Falls, and knocked on the door several times, but didn't get an answer. They tried to open the door and discovered that it was unlocked. On entry, they were met with the sight of a house in disarray, littered with plastic cups, 2 used ashtrays, and full garbage bags on the balcony. The scene looked like a party had taken place. However, the atmosphere in the house was tense and foreboding. They decided to check the bedroom and were shocked at the sight they saw upon opening the door. Angie lay naked and bloodied with her head propped against the wall. They quickly called the police and paramedics arrived, but Angie was declared dead at the scene. Her family was also informed of the news, and they were beyond devastated that their little angel was gone.
She was not only my baby, but she was my only daughter. She was extremely intelligent. She didn't take no for an answer.
An autopsy was carried out on Angie's body, and 14 stab wounds were discovered. Male fluid was found inside her, and there were signs of sexual assault.
I can see that she has some extensive lacerations or incisions, stab wounds, and there is a horrific wound to the throat.
The estimated time of her death was placed between 12:15 and 4:45 a.m. on June 13th. Her beddings and clothes were also taken for tests, and strands of hair which didn't belong to her were found. After performing DNA tests, it was discovered that the male fluid and the strands of hair belonged to the same person. The police also searched the house for clues and discovered that there were no signs of a break-in, but the state of the house indicated that there might have been a struggle. Angie was quite tall, standing close to 6 feet. Considering her size, the brave girl likely put up a fight before her killer overpowered her. The murder weapon, though, wasn't found in the house. All knives in Angie's house were accounted for, and this indicated that the person brought the weapon with the intention of hurting the victim. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator was likely a friend or acquaintance of Angie and was granted entry before turning violent against her. They did, however, consider that it was possible that Angie didn't lock her doors that night. This would have given the attacker a chance to gain entry and take Angie by surprise. Given the party at the house the night before, investigators explored the idea that someone might have been observing her throughout the night before deciding to act. Another possibility considered was that more than one person could have been involved in the crime, but as of now, nothing was concrete. The search for the killer began in earnest as family, friends, and acquaintances were questioned to determine who might have committed the crime. An elderly woman who lived a floor below Angie's apartment said she never heard any noise throughout the night. The other neighbors around the house also said the same thing. Friends who were at Angie's house for the party were also interrogated, and DNA samples were collected from the men. Unfortunately, none matched the sample discovered in Angie's apartment. Days turned to weeks as leads dwindled, and the police's best bet for nabbing the killer was a DNA match. But despite the numerous samples collected from men in the neighborhood, none turned out to be a match. Angie had to be buried even as her family still sought answers. Her funeral was attended by family and friends in the community whom she touched with her warm personality. With no answers forthcoming from investigators, pressure began to mount from family, the community, as well as the media. The neighborhood was shaken by the rare occurrence of the heinous crime and needed the perpetrator locked behind bars in order to feel safe again.
When you have a crime like this, violent, horrible, it fills everybody in the community with anxiety.
However, the Idaho Falls Police Department, IFPD, were at the time ill-equipped to solve the crime, but couldn't outright admit it. DNA technology had yet to become as proficient as it is today. Carol Dodge recognized these limitations and was ready to walk the extra mile to ensure that her daughter's killer was caught no matter what. She printed flyers and offered $5,000 to anyone who might have information about the night her daughter was killed. She'd constantly check on the police to see what they were up to regarding the case. Her visits became too frequent, and she became less welcome at the police station. Some of the officers started mocking her, calling her a crazy, grieving mother. In January 1997, 7 months after the tragic crime shook the community, another similar attack happened in a neighboring town, but in the state of Nevada. A man named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested for sexually assaulting a woman while threatening her with a knife during the act. He, however, didn't kill his victim, and she was able to report the terrifying incident to the police. This arrest raised the hopes of the investigators in Idaho, not only because the crime was similar, but because Hobbs lived in Idaho Falls and was an acquaintance of Angie. Collaborating with officers in Nevada, the IFPD was able to obtain Hobbs's DNA for testing. However, the results turned out to be a disappointment. Hobbs was not the man they were looking for. They then turned to other men around him in the case that their theory of a second perpetrator was true. In their search, they found Hobbs's best friend, Christopher Taps, and invited him for questioning. Taps was a 19-year-old high school dropout who was part of a friend group known by the community as the River Rats. This group of friends were notorious for wandering aimlessly around the city and drinking even though they weren't yet of age. Taps was also discovered to have known Angie before her death. For a stretch of 3 weeks, Taps was repeatedly called in for interrogation by the police, who tried to pry information that might link Hobbs to the crime. They also subjected Taps to 7 lie detector tests in a bid to get him to confess. However, the boy claimed he had no information about the incident. Investigators grew increasingly frustrated with Taps, who wouldn't provide the information they needed. They even offered Taps immunity if he gave them more info, but Taps remained tight-lipped. Detectives grew suspicious of Taps's refusal to talk and began to investigate him further. Again, the police department carried out a new lie detector test on Taps and invited a polygraph expert. From the results of the test, the expert concluded that Taps was lying. With the threat of a graver punishment hanging over him if he continued to hold out, Taps finally decided to confess. According to Taps, he and Benjamin had broken into Angie's apartment that night and carried out the attack.
You hold her down, okay, while she's being cut.
Satisfied that they'd nabbed the criminal, the police now had probable cause to obtain his DNA in order to have conclusive evidence tying him to the crime. When the results came back, it was another disappointment, as Taps's DNA did not match the one found on Angie. Detectives returned to interrogating Taps, demanding that he reveal the exact person who had committed the sexual assault. Taps mentioned a mutual friend of himself and Hobbs, Jeremy Sargis, who was also promptly brought in for interrogation. Sargis's DNA was tested, and once again, he was a negative match. The dejected detectives told Taps that because he'd lied and refused to reveal the real perpetrator, the immunity earlier promised was no longer on the table. They encouraged him to cooperate with them, and in return, they'd have his punishment lessened to life imprisonment instead of the capital punishment sentence. Taps then gave a confession that he'd orchestrated the whole crime and carried out the attack that led to the death of Angie all by himself. Taps was charged to court, and his trial began in May 1998. It was widely attended by people in the community who were eager to see the accused murderer. During the trial, Taps refused to plead guilty and claimed he made the confession under duress. Detectives, however, brought a witness who put the final nail in his coffin. A lady named Destiny Osborne claimed she overheard Taps bragging about committing the crime during a party. After a 13-hour deliberation, Taps was declared guilty by the unanimous decision of a jury seated in Bonneville County Court. While the court had declared Taps guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment, the Dodge family was unsatisfied. There was still the lingering question of who exactly the DNA found in Angie's apartment belonged to. Carol was especially frustrated that Taps had decided to keep the identity of the real perpetrator a secret. She wondered if it was out of fear or loyalty that the boy kept mute. In 2001, Taps withdrew his confession and appealed his conviction. However, the Idaho Supreme Court dismissed his appeal. While he was in prison, Taps wrote to Carol stating that he did not kill her daughter, and neither did he have a clue as to what really transpired that night. Carol didn't believe him, but held on to her theory that he was trying to protect someone by refusing to confess. By 2008, Angie's case had gone cold as Taps was in jail and there was no new leads pointing to who might have left the DNA. Carol would still visit the detectives reviewing files and evidence just to see if something was missed. She decided to review Taps's interrogation tapes as part of her personal investigation. After watching about 60 hours of footage, Carol concluded that Taps was telling her the truth, and he had, indeed, been coerced into the confession. She noted that Taps had given about 6 different and sometimes contradictory confessions. He also couldn't give a satisfactory description of Angie's apartment, as he missed several important details. In that same year, 2008, Taps sent a letter to the Idaho Innocence Project, an organization that helped wrongfully convicted persons to regain their freedom. Simultaneously, Carol also contacted Taps's lawyer, John Thomas, expressing her readiness to help get Taps out of jail. Carol, Taps's lawyer, and the Idaho Innocence Project joined forces together and began to fight for Taps's release. However, an attempt to get his conviction reviewed turned futile that same year. In 2013, Carol and Taps met Stephen Dreisen, an expert on false confessions, and employed him to review the interrogation tapes of Taps. At the conclusion of the review, Mr. Dreisen wrote a report to the Idaho Appeal Court stating that Taps's interrogation was forced. However, the prosecution had to make its own findings before the report could yield positive results for Taps. In 2014, with the new surge of development in DNA technology, a potential suspect was identified. Investigators used the technique of forensic genetic genealogy to compare the DNA evidence from the crime scene with those in a genealogical database owned by Ancestry.com, a DNA testing company. The analysis revealed a man who had a partial match with the DNA evidence. The suspect, Michael Usury, spelled U-S-S-E-R-Y, was from the Usury family tree, spelled U-S-R-Y, but with a slight change in the surname. This was not an unusual occurrence, as family names evolve over time. Michael, who lived in Louisiana at the time, was met by police officers from Idaho who questioned him about his whereabouts on the night of June 12, 1996, and the morning of June 13, 1996. Incidentally, Usury said he'd been in Idaho with friends on a trip at that time. Usury was not told why he'd been questioned, and the policeman only gave vague answers when he asked what had happened. When they left, Usury quickly went on his computer to check what had happened in Idaho Falls on that particular day he was asked about. Michael started to panic when he saw the news reports. However, the next year, in January 2015, detectives from Idaho Falls gave him a call and assured him that he was not in any trouble, as his DNA was not a sufficient match to the DNA evidence. However, they also informed him that he was a distant relative to the perpetrator of the crime. In 2015, the prosecution finally hired its own independent expert on forced confession, who also reviewed Taps's interrogation tapes. The expert confirmed Dreisen's findings and concluded that the confessions were coerced. In 2016, prosecutor Daniel Clark finally filed a motion for relief after conviction in order to secure Taps's release. Before the motion was filed, a deal was reached between the prosecution and Taps's attorney, John Thomas. They agreed that the first-degree murder charge would still remain on Taps's record, but the rape charge would be dismissed as Taps's DNA negative match was conclusive evidence that he did not commit the crime. Taps was resentenced to serve 20 years for the murder charge, with the years he'd already served put into consideration. Essentially, he'd become a free man.
And therefore, since both Mr. Tapp and his counsel and the state have stipulated that this court has jurisdiction in the 2 civil cases that are already before this court, as well as the original criminal case, CR 1997-481, I hereby rule as follows. The defendant, Mr. Tapp, having been found guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree and Part 2 deadly weapon enhancement, that the defendant is guilty of that offense. That his sentence on that offense is amended to a unified fixed term of 20 years, plus any additional time that you, Mr. Tapp, have served up to and including today, March 22nd, 2017. That the fine or court cost of $78.50 remains in effect, as does the crime victim compensation of $2,500. You are receiving credit by order of this court for all of the time served today, up to today, with the intent that you be released from custody today from your sentence having been completed are satisfied.
However, Taps was to give up all rights to appeal the case. Desperate for his freedom after years of imprisonment, Taps accepted the deal. Taps was released from prison in March 2017 after 20 long years of imprisonment. Carol was present at the hearing to welcome Taps back home. Throughout the quest to set him free, the two had become close friends, exchanging correspondence. She held his hands high as they both left the courtroom in partial victory. For Taps, his release represented a fresh chapter in his life. He went to prison as a teenager in the 20th century and returned as an adult in this new, speedy 21st century.
It is overwhelming and scary. You know, the night before they released me, I called Carol. And she says, "Are you ready?" I said, I told her, "Carol, I'm scared. It's not because I'm scared to be free. I was scared because how much the world has changed."
Aside from being grateful to finally be out, Taps said he was scared of how much the world had changed in the 2 decades he'd spent in prison. His former friends had moved on with life and started new jobs. Unfortunately for Taps, he remained an outcast in the town. Despite Carol's support, the community still regarded him as a criminal, and he had a hard time reintegrating into society. He knew that getting out of prison was not enough. He had to completely prove his innocence. To achieve this, he decided to spend his first few years of freedom helping Carol to find their daughter's true killer. After securing Taps's release in 2017, Carol returned to the dead end earlier and met with Michael Usury. She visited Michael in person, handed him a sheet of paper, and asked him to write down all the relatives he knew. In 2018, while searching her computer for DNA labs that could help with her case, Carol found the Parabon lab headed by Cece Moore, a genealogy expert who had helped law enforcement across the country solve over 70 cold cases at the time. When contacted by the Idaho police, Moore was reluctant to accept the case because the DNA evidence samples had degraded after over 20 years of storage. However, Carol contacted Moore and pleaded her for help, explaining how hard and long she'd been searching for answers. In May of 2018, Moore decided to take on the Herculean task of using a publicly accessible database called GEDmatch to find the killer. Parabon Lab was able to use the DNA evidence to make predictions about the criminal's physical profile, which included ancestry, eye color, hair color, skin color, freckling, and face shape. By combining these details, the possible image of the suspect was constructed. Aside from using genetic genealogy, Moore also used public records like newspaper archives, public family trees, and obituaries to produce a list of 6 possible leads for the IFPD. Detectives began covertly following the men to obtain DNA from discarded cigarette butts, beer cans, and other used items. Within 6 days, these items were collected from all 6 men and the samples were sent to the lab. Hopes were high for Carol, Moore, as well as the police officers. The results came in within days, and unfortunately, there was no match. Moore was especially devastated as she was sure the criminal was on the list she made. In spite of the setback, Moore was unrelenting. She returned to the family tree she'd built using the genetic matches to cross-check for any mistakes or oversights. Suddenly, she came upon a new piece of information that could lead to a major breakthrough. A man from the Usury family tree named Clarence had a short and childless marriage in his early 20s, or so the records said. Clarence's wife had married another man named Drips shortly after their divorce. However, she delivered a baby just a few months into her new marriage. With the time frame, it was evident that she was pregnant before her divorce. The baby boy named Brian Lee was born into the second marriage and was given his stepfather's surname. With more investigation came an even more interesting fact. Brian Lee Drips had lived in Idaho Falls just across from Angie's house in 1996. He was one of the men the IFPD first interviewed during the first set of interrogations in 1996, but for some reason, his DNA was never tested. In May 2019, detectives started to follow Drips, who now lived in Caldwell, a neighboring city to Idaho Falls. They were able to obtain a cigarette butt which he threw by the road and took it for testing. The lab, now familiar with the case and the urgent need to crack it, worked overnight to analyze the DNA. By morning, the result was out. They had found their man. Drips's DNA was a positive match with the male fluid and the hair found during Angie's autopsy. Police arrested Drips on May 14, 2019 during a traffic stop and brought him in for interrogation. When he was told the reason for his arrest, Drips denied the allegations. After 5 hours of grilling with factual evidence brought before him, Drips requested a cigarette. He took a long pull, looked to the detectives and said, "Yeah, looks like you guys got me." He also admitted to having acted alone in the attack. After years of searching, the police were more than thrilled to have Drips prosecuted. He was charged that same day, May 15, 2019, with murder and... The next month, on June 8, 2019, his highly anticipated trial began. In his testimony, Drips told the judge that he was under the influence of narcotics that night and never intended to kill Angie. According to him, he only held the knife to her neck during the assault, but didn't remember stabbing Angie. In his plea deal with prosecutors, Drips pleaded guilty to all the charges against him and was handed a 20 years life prison sentence by District Judge Joel Tingey. Speaking in her victim impact statement, Carol told Drips, "You have shattered our family. There's no way to pick up the pieces ever again. You, Brian Drips, deserve eternal hell." The Dodge family, as well as the wrongly convicted Tapps, was elated with the judgment. Angie's brother, Brent Dodge, said after the sentencing, "I would describe it as probably a milestone in that path to continuing the healing process." Tapps was also completely exonerated of all the charges and went ahead to sue the IFPD for how he was treated in 1996. In 2022, he was awarded an $11.7 million settlement. He also received an apology from the state of Idaho. Based on their harrowing experience, the Dodge family decided to give back to society and started a fundraiser called 5 for Hope. The initiative was to help families and victims of unsolved cases carry out investigations and seek justice for their loved ones. On May 15, 1957, Lawrence Joseph Bader, an American salesman from Ohio, mysteriously disappeared while fishing on Lake Erie. Lawrence didn't return back home. Instead, the news of his disappearance reached his family. Even though the police were called by the family in hopes of finding the 31-year-old man, the search did not yield any results. Lawrence was officially declared dead 3 years later, with the statement that Lawrence must have drowned and died since there was a huge storm on the day of his disappearance. However, a strange, spine-chilling discovery made almost 8 years after his death left everyone flabbergasted. What was the discovery that was made? Were there more secrets hidden behind Lawrence's mysterious disappearance? One of the most populated cities of Ohio, Akron is situated on the western edge of the glaciated Allegheny Plateau in northeast Ohio, about 40 miles south of downtown Cleveland. With a population of about 190,000, Akron is ranked 136th most populous city of the United States. Having a long history of rubber and tire manufacturing, Akron earned its title as the rubber capital of the world. It was also once known as a center of airship development. Today, Akron is known for manufacturing, education, healthcare, and biomedical research. Going by crime rate comparison, Akron has 82.84% higher crime rate than the national average, which is quite an eye-catching figure. The crime rate of Akron is about 4,250 per 100,000 residents. With this in perspective, let's dive into today's case to explore the spine-chilling horrors involved in this story set in Akron. Lawrence Joseph Bader, popularly known as Larry, was born on December 2, 1926 in Akron, Ohio, to Dr. Stephen Bader, who was one of the city's leading dentists at the time. Thus, his family was quite well known and respected in the community. Larry had 3 brothers and a sister, and his family was strictly Catholic. While growing up, Larry was a shy and introverted boy. It was the time of World War II when Larry was enjoying his teens. He, like most of his friends, decided to drop out of school and serve in the Navy instead during his late teens. After 2 years of service, Larry decided to get a high school diploma and ended up leaving the Navy to join the University of Akron. His years in the university were quite gloomy as he was not at all interested in academics. The only good thing that happened to him at the university was a girl named Mary Lou Knapp, with whom he fell in love and ended up getting married to on April 19, 1952. Larry was the type of guy who couldn't focus on one particular thing and was often restless. That was why he'd look for easy ways to earn a big profit, since he wasn't keen to earn a living by doing a job. Larry also owned a hamburger stall when he was studying in the university, and this was one of the main reasons why he failed to focus on his academics. In the end, he left the university to settle down with his wife. Larry moved into a new house that he bought along with his wife. The couple spent their happily married life in their own small world, and soon Mary Lou blessed their family by birthing 3 children. Larry loved his 3 children, but was also excited about having another one on the way. They settled down in a house near the West Hill neighborhood of Akron, but Larry was hardly seen socializing with the people of the community. He was quite introverted and loved to keep to himself. He had a passion for hunting and even wore buckskin while doing so. Larry was quite gifted when it came to archery and once happened to win a tri-state archery contest. Beer was the best friend of Larry. He'd often drink beer with his friends, and they'd talk till late. He'd sometimes joke around or pull a few tricks, like eating a whole chicken along with the bones. Larry was known to be a cheerful man by his family and his circle of close friends, but apart from them, he didn't really mingle with strangers. Even though Larry enjoyed quick schemes to get rich, he decided to change once and for all after starting a family. He decided to be a cookware salesman for the company called Fritz Zebb at Lifetime Distributors. When it came to financial affairs, Larry faced no difficulties since his family was quite well off and his father was willing to help him in any way possible. But Larry never asked for his father's aid. His self-esteem always barred him from asking for his father's money, and hence he owned up to the monetary responsibilities of himself and his family. In the 1950s, a $17,000 mortgage meant that it equaled about $200,000 in today's time, and the cost of raising 3 kids started to affect his small yearly income of $10,000. In addition, he owed taxes to the Internal Revenue Service. Due to this, Larry had a constant fear of what might happen to him or his family based on the debts that he had accumulated. Hence, he took out a life insurance policy so that his family was taken care of if anything happened to him in the future. On the morning of May 15, 1957, Larry decided to plan and prepare for some alone time. He packed a small suitcase and his fishing rod in his Pontiac and told his wife that after his work hours, he'd go fishing that day. His wife didn't fancy the idea and told Larry that she didn't like staying in the house alone now that she was pregnant with his other child. She wished Larry would just come straight back home after work to spend time with her. To this, Larry shrugged and replied, "Maybe I will, maybe I won't," before heading out. Then he drove to Cleveland to resolve a few checks given to him by some customers. Once he was done with that, he went to pay some bills, which included his latest life insurance premium, and withdrew $400 through a check. Then, as midday hit, he decided he'd go fishing right away and drove to Lake Erie. He wanted to have a peaceful afternoon after the hustle and bustle of the busy morning. Larry reached the Rocky River and drove to a spot called Eddie's Boathouse, where the river met the lake. Then he took his suitcase and his fishing rod and started to look around for a boat to hire. Soon enough, he found a 14-foot boat to rent and immediately asked the owner, Lawrence C. Cutler, if he could get lights installed in the boat. The owner warned him to be back before it got dark, and Larry promised to do so, but he still wanted his lights to be set up. The owner complied, but told Larry that huge clouds had formed in the sky and there was a great chance of a storm coming. Larry gave his word that he'd return early, handed the owner the $400 he'd withdrawn earlier that day, and set out. As the sun was setting, the Coast Guard spotted Larry and went up to him to warn him about the increasing speed of the wind and the possibility of a thunderstorm. Larry dismissed them by saying that he'd experienced these types of situations before. About 3 hours later, a violent storm hit Lake Erie and started to destroy the rhythm of the water. It went on for a couple of hours before slowly subsiding. The owner of the boat, however, started to get anxious when Larry didn't return before dark as he promised. He decided to call the authorities the next day when he realized that Larry had still not returned. On May 16, 1957, the authorities, along with the Coast Guards, started to patrol the area near Lake Erie where Larry was last seen fishing. It didn't take them long to find the boat that was lying at Perkins Beach, about 5 miles down the shore. The boat still had the gear and life jackets that Larry took with him the previous day. The boat also had one of the 2 oars provided by the owner, but one thing that was missing from the boat was the small suitcase that Larry had taken with him while venturing out for fishing. Another significant observation made by the investigators was that the boat didn't have any major damage, so as to indicate that it might have met with an accident during the storm. Moreover, there was also no sign that the boat had capsized. The investigators claimed that if the boat had indeed capsized and Larry had fallen into the water, he would have died immediately because the water was too violent due to the storm. There was one more thing that the investigators discovered. The fuel line to the boat's engine was disconnected, which experts said was not something that can happen by itself without any external help. There was also another thing that caught the investigators' eyes. Larry had taken out a life insurance policy earlier that year and had boosted his accidental death clause so that in case something happened to him, his family would be taken care of. Despite these strange revelations, the police kept searching for Lawrence Bader since his family, especially his wife, believed that he'd come back home. She said that Larry would be found and he'd be present during the birth of their fourth child. Unfortunately, even the constant prayers of his family didn't help the investigators to find him or any clues about his whereabouts. 3 years later, in 1960, Lawrence Bader was officially and legally declared to be dead. As the family of Lawrence was mourning his death, a strange event was taking place in the city of Omaha, Nebraska. Between May 18th to 20th, 1957, a quite handsome and distinguished gentleman visited a Round Table bar in hopes of finding a job. The bartender at that time, Mrs. Betty Augustine, said that he had an outgoing, extroverted personality and a very well-maintained thin pencil mustache. He was wearing slacks and a sports jacket while carrying a navy blue bag and a small suitcase. The man introduced himself as John Francis Johnson, popularly known as Fritz. Betty gave him the news that there were no slots open at that moment, but added that the Ross's Steakhouse might have some room left for hiring new employees. Thus, Fritz decided to head toward the said location. When Fritz reached Ross's Steakhouse, the owner decided to take a small interview before hiring him. He asked Fritz what he was doing in Omaha, and Fritz replied that he'd just returned after serving in the Navy for 13 years because he'd injured his back. Now he preferred traveling a lot and was planning to stay in Omaha for a while. Pleased by his charismatic personality, Fritz was hired by the owner. His outgoing and bubbly personality soon started to attract a lot of customers to the restaurant. They loved to hear Fritz talk about his cruel childhood in Boston. He used to narrate tales about his past, like how he was an orphan but was found on the doorstep of a family house. He'd also tell fascinating war stories and how he joined the Navy when he was just 17 years old. He also fought during World War II and the Korean War before he acquired his back injury when he was blown off a destroyer during a submarine attack. These intriguing stories would keep the customers hooked. His extroverted nature helped him build many friendships, and he'd often invite them to his house for champagne parties after his work hours. But there was something strange that the visitors noticed. Fritz did not have any furniture at home. All he had were a few pillows and a fish tank filled with fighting fish. Fritz was also a huge flirt, and his charismatic personality never failed to impress the ladies. He'd often bring women to his house or just indulge in intimate activities in his old hearse van. Fritz was known as the strange man due to some of his habits. He was known to date his chicks by season, like summer, spring, and winter, rather than by the date. Fritz was also never unhappy because he never batted his eyes towards any bad news. He didn't even watch TV or read the newspaper, in case any bad news might bring him down. He soon went to KBON to practice DJing with the equipment, and by the end of 1959, they decided to hire him as a DJ. Soon, Fritz became a sort of a local celebrity. In 1961, he started to appear on camera, becoming a sports director and announcer at KETV, a local cable TV channel. In 1961, he met and married a 20-year-old model named Nancy Zimmer and even adopted her daughter. In 1964, unpleasant news came crashing into the happy and cheerful life of Fritz. A cancerous tumor was found behind Fritz's left eye. The doctors advised him to undergo surgery, and Fritz agreed. During the process of removing the tumor, he lost his eye. Due to this, he started wearing an eye patch, which somehow made him look even more charismatic. He started to do archery, a sport he claimed to play back in the days while trying to heal his damaged back, and was quite skilled in the sport. Soon he started competing at the state level and was crowned the Nebraska archery champion. The Saunders Archery Company also approached him to represent them at sporting goods shows, and he readily agreed. In February 1965, Saunders sent Fritz to a show held at the McCormick Place, a convention center in Chicago. Fritz was quite excited to be there and started to casually converse with people. Fritz soon spotted a man who was intensely staring down at him. The look on his face was as if he saw a ghost. At first, Fritz ignored him, but when the man returned back in the evening, this time with a woman, Fritz started to get curious. The lady who accompanied the man also stared at Fritz with horror and finally walked up to him. What she said next sent shivers down Fritz's spine. She muttered, "Pardon me, but aren't you my uncle, Larry Bader, who disappeared 7 years ago?" The man who was staring at Fritz was Fritz's neighbor when he used to live in Akron, Ohio. The neighbor told Fritz that despite his eye patch and the changes in the appearances of Fritz in the last 7 years, he definitely looked like the son of Dr. Bader. Fritz kept denying this and emphasized that he was Fritz, not Larry. The man was conflicted since Larry was announced dead 8 years ago while fishing in Lake Erie, and so he decided to call John Bader, the brother of Larry. John, surprised by the news, immediately called his cousin Suzanne to go and check if the news was indeed correct since she lived nearby. When Suzanne drove up to the sports event and saw Fritz, her doubts were cleared. It was indeed Larry Bader. That's why she decided to walk up to him and ask if she was her uncle, Larry. Fritz, thinking it was some kind of a prank being played at the Nebraska champion, humored the whole situation, saying he didn't know or recognize either the neighbor or Suzanne. Desperate to prove herself, she asked Fritz if he'd talked to his brother, John, over the phone, and Fritz readily agreed. He thought that speaking to the brother would solve this case of mistaken identity, but the moment John heard Fritz's voice, he didn't hesitate to declare that it was his own brother Larry Bader's voice on the other end. Surprised by this newly discovered news, Fritz agreed to meet John and his older brother Rich. The brothers booked a private jet for Fritz to fly to Chicago so that they could talk about this matter. When Fritz finally met up with the brothers, they kept insisting that he was indeed Larry Bader, but Fritz denied it every time. He said that he might just look and sound like Larry, which could be true, but on considering their personalities, they don't match at all. Fritz was a charismatic, well-dressed local celebrity, whereas Larry was mostly a laid-back family man who was introverted and loved to isolate himself by doing activities like fishing. Fritz, however, always loved to engage with people. To this, John and Rich argued that when Larry was a child, he did act a lot like Fritz. He was outgoing and loved to make new friends. Fritz was not convinced, so the brothers asked for one last request. They wanted to know if Fritz would give a sample of his fingerprint to check with Larry's naval records. Once again, Fritz didn't hesitate at all and accompanied the two brothers to the police station. They took his fingerprints and sent them to the FBI. Fritz was certain that the fingerprints wouldn't match since he'd never heard about this Larry before, but somehow he felt a little agitated. The next day, the results came in, and the police told them that his and Larry's fingerprints were identical. That meant either he was Larry, or it was some sort of an unexplained phenomenon from the outer world. This hit Fritz hard because he was certain that he was not Larry Bader. He argued that he couldn't remember anything related to the time when he was Larry if he was indeed Larry Bader. His world came crashing down, and so did someone else's. Larry's wife, Mary Lou, was shocked to learn that her husband was alive. She was finally moving on and even found another man that she was planning to marry soon, but this news completely shattered her. Being Catholic, she couldn't divorce Larry and had to end relations with her present fiancé. But this wasn't her only concern. Mary Lou was receiving $254 as Social Security every month ever since Larry was declared dead. She also had $39,500 as life insurance, and her mortgage of $17,000 was paid off. There was also $20,000 in taxes left to be paid that Larry owed. Though Fritz kept on arguing that he was not Larry Bader, he started to send a small amount of money to Mary Lou from his salary. Things, however, started to go downhill for Fritz as well. He was fired from his job, and his wife Nancy, unable to withstand this new secret that had been unraveled, told Fritz to leave. Fritz moved into a room in the YMCA and got back to bartending. With the two families to support, an earning of just $100 a week was not enough. Out of this, $50 went to Mary Lou and $20 went to Nancy. Soon, people started to gossip if Fritz was indeed a fraudster, but Fritz was adamant, saying that he had no relation to Larry whatsoever. But in order to get some answers, Fritz's lawyer hired a bunch of psychologists and neurologists to examine him for 10 days. They used all the equipment and solutions which were available to them so as to find an answer. In the end, they declared that Fritz was indeed not lying and had no memory of being Larry before he completely restarted his life. But they also couldn't find any reason behind this memory loss of Fritz. His lawyer, however, blamed the memory loss of Fritz on his tumor found in his eye. He argued that the nerves connecting the eye to the brain must have damaged some parts of his brain when he was suffering from cancer, resulting in his memory loss. This was never really proven to be true by the doctors. Since Fritz didn't know that he was a fraudster because he genuinely didn't remember anything about him being Larry Bader, the court couldn't charge him with a crime. The need to punish him would never actually arise because soon he started to experience severe stomach pain, and when examined, the doctors found out that the cancer found in his eye had spread to his liver. A few days later, on September 15, 1966, Fritz, or Larry, died in Omaha's St. Joseph's Hospital. He was 39 years old when he took his last breath. Living his life as two different people, two funerals were held in memory of both Fritz and Larry. A memorial was held in Omaha for Fritz, and then the next day, he was brought to Akron to be buried as Larry in the Bader's family plot. The mystery of this case started to build gossip among the community. Some believed that on the day that Larry went fishing, he must have had a really bad injury while falling off the boat during the storm. This might have been the reason why he couldn't remember being Larry. This could be true since cases like this have occurred previously. When a person faces trauma, they tend to forget the events related to the trauma and try to build a whole different self or personality to cope with it. If a person has a fantasy life he wants to live in, but couldn't due to various boundaries in his current life, he would tend to adopt those fantastical habits and lifestyles if he creates his own new personality. This is called the dissociative fugue, which can be the reason behind Fritz's behavior. The problem was that when stimulation of the events or people connected to the trauma return, the memories related to them also tend to come back, but this didn't happen in the case of Fritz. He couldn't remember his previous wife, Mary Lou, or his brothers, John and Rich. Some people believed that he was just schizophrenic, meaning he had a dissociative identity disorder. Fritz was just another personality of Larry and took over him during the boat accident because of some kind of trauma that might have triggered him that day. Again, the problem with this theory is that schizophrenic people are aware that there are other personalities of them, but in the case of Fritz, he spoke about Larry as if he was a whole different person. Another theory that was highly talked about was the fact that Larry might have been just a brilliant liar. Psychological tests weren't advanced during those times, so Larry knew he'd be able to get away by forming these lies. Maybe he was frustrated by his daily life and the huge amounts of debts he owed and simply wanted to start a new life. This thus explains a lot of things. The most unsettling fact was that the suitcase that Larry carried with him while he went out to fish on that fateful day was missing when the investigators searched the boat thoroughly. Moreover, Larry appeared as Fritz a few days later, but was dressed sophisticatedly and looked rich with the same suitcase in his hands. People believed that he must have formulated this whole plan and faked his own death. This again had its loopholes. If Larry wanted to run away from his past by forming those excellent lies, why did he cooperate with everyone who wanted to prove him as Larry Bader? Was this another of his lies and he formed this whole plan knowing that he might get caught one day? Whatever the reason or the explanation behind this strange case, it never fails to give chills to people. Being one of the most thrilling and eerie cases, the case of Lawrence Bader continues to be a mystery.
911 emergency operator to Caroline.
Yeah, I wonder why it's taking the cops so long to get here.
Can you provide me the address so I can look it up?
2086 Mound Street.
0118.
It's absolutely incredible.
Seconds. Has something changed since you originally called?
What now? What?
Has anything changed since you originally called?
Yes, he's not answering. Like I'm outside her fucking window yelling and nobody's answering. You guys need to get a cop here quick.
Sir, the officers are on the way.
Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on Saturday, February 15, 2020, Los Angeles police officers arrived at the Hollywood Hills home of well-known therapist Amie Harwick. The 38-year-old woman was found lying on the pavement below her balcony, barely clinging to life. Despite being rushed to hospital for emergency care, she'd eventually succumbed to her injuries 2 hours later. Investigators were turned to those closest to the much-loved doctor and uncover the shadows from her past that followed her to her death. But what enemies had Amie made? And what could have led to such a violent end for her? Commonly known as the City of Angels, Los Angeles in California is the county seat of Los Angeles County and the second most populous city in the United States with a population of 3.7 million as of 2020. It's also the home of the silver screen industry, Hollywood. Los Angeles has a strong Spanish culture dating back to the 16th century, but these days, the population is much more diverse as people from around the world go there seeking fame and fortune. Like other cities of its size, Los Angeles too has its fair share of crime, and rates have been fluctuating since the early 1980s. Though there's been a decline in homicides, gang-related crimes still prevail in lower-income neighborhoods, and violent crimes have increased by 5.7%. And in 2020, Los Angeles became the backdrop of a real-life crime thriller. At around 1 a.m. on Saturday, February 15, 2020, Michael Herman was asleep in his first-floor bedroom in the home he shared with roommate Dr. Amie Harwick. He was awakened by the sound of thudding coming from above. But as he slowly drifted back to sleep, he was once again woken up by a woman screaming. Alert but disoriented, Michael tried to find his phone as the screams continued to filter downstairs. Unable to find his phone, he ran out and stood at the staircase before he screamed to the intruder to leave his roommate alone. Panicked, Michael ran out of the house and climbed over a fence separating his home from his neighbors. He knocked repeatedly on the doors of both neighbors, but there was no answer. Instead, he saw someone walking along on the sidewalk and called out for assistance. Michael was able to use the stranger's phone to contact the Los Angeles Police Department. He spent the next few agonizing minutes waiting for them to arrive. At around 1:30 a.m., officers arrived at the home of Amie and Michael and performed a quick sweep of the area. Michael was visibly distraught as he explained to officers about what happened.
Okay, so you have access to here?
No.
Is there anybody else inside the house?
My roommate.
Just your roommate by yourself?
Yes. Dude, I heard screaming. I don't know if that guy had a gun or a knife. I came running I couldn't find my phone or
So is there somebody else inside?
Yes. So I think there's
Okay, sir, do me a favor. Calm down. Other than your roommate, is there anybody else inside the house?
I don't know. No, I just heard her screaming.
Have you called?
I threw him to the ground. I've been calling for her through his windows. Nobody's answering. Nothing.
Hey, let's get an additional unit.
It's not building search.
Yeah, I know, but...
We can if you want.
Yeah,
we're going to go in there.
Yeah, I know.
As officers did a quick perimeter search before entering the house, they found the body of a woman lying on the pavement below the third-floor balcony. Michael immediately identified Amie, who was unconscious and breathing raggedly. She was rushed to the nearest hospital for immediate treatment. However, she succumbed to her injuries just 2 hours after being found. A homicide investigation was launched immediately as detectives tried to retrace the life of Amie and the events that led to her murder. Amie Nicole Harwick was born on May 20th, 1981 in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. She was adopted by Tom and Penny Harwick and raised in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, alongside her adoptive older brother, Chris. Amie was described as being a cheerful and kind child, trait she carried well into adulthood. After graduating North Penn High School in 1999, Amie made the move to Los Angeles and pursued an undergraduate degree at California Polytechnic State University. She worked part-time as a dancer and even modeled for Playboy to help pay for her college education. She'd eventually go on to pursue a master's degree in clinical psychology in 2012 and study towards her doctorate. Amie had an interest in the macabre and magic and was a fan of the goth rock scene. Amie also had a fascination with death and was an avid fan of true crime. She also enjoyed the Hollywood lifestyle and spending time with her large group of friends. Amie would eventually make her mark in Hollywood and become a well-respected family and marriage therapist. She had her own YouTube channel, authored a book in 2014 titled The Sex Bible for Women, and Amie was also a regular guest on podcasts and television talk shows. She was even engaged to Hollywood comedian Drew Carey before the couple decided to part ways in November 2018. To investigators, it appeared as though Amie was well-loved and successful, which left them puzzled as to who would want to hurt her in any way. Investigators swept through the house to search for clues. On the first floor, they found a broken window pane from the French door and pieces of glass on the floor. They questioned Michael about the broken glass. He explained to officers that around 9 p.m. he heard glass breaking and assumed that either Amie had dropped a plate or the cat had pushed a dish over when it jumped on the counter. Michael then heard someone walk past his bedroom and go upstairs, once again assuming it was Amie. Investigators surmised that this was how the intruder had gotten to the house. In the third-floor bedroom, they found the signs of a violent struggle. In the doorway to Amie's bedroom, investigators found blood and blood splatter. There was also a trail of beads that appeared to have come from a necklace that the victim was probably wearing. The trail of beads led to the balcony from which they presumed Amie was eventually thrown off, falling 20 feet and landing on the patio in her backyard. On the balcony, they found a syringe filled with a clear liquid. This was bagged and sent off for testing. The results from Amie's autopsy showed that she died due to being manually strangled and blunt force trauma to the head and torso. She also had defensive wounds on her arms and hands, which led them to believe she'd put up quite the fight. Investigators also received the test results from the liquid found in the syringe. It turned out to be liquid nicotine. Officers spread out around the neighborhood to question neighbors and collect any surveillance footage they could provide. They were able to find footage that showed a man dressed in all black interfering with a Ring camera at around 8:53 p.m. that evening. The man is once again seen walking past the camera after 1:11 a.m. early the next morning. Investigators were sure that this was the man responsible for attacking and murdering Amie. They believed that it was possible that this man was lying in wait for Amie in her house, given all the investigation clues. Investigators from the Los Angeles Police Department turned to Amie's friends to find out about her movements from that night and any possible enemies she may have had. On the evening of February 14, 2020, Amie joined her friends for a burlesque show in downtown Los Angeles. Afterwards, they all left to spend the rest of the evening at the Nomad Hotel, also in downtown LA. According to her friends, she left the hotel sometime after midnight and texted back and forth with a few people during her cab ride home, asking them to send her the pictures they took from that night. Once at home at around 1 a.m., Amie and her best friend, Robert Koshland, had a brief text exchange. The two had been planning a trip to Scotland in April 2020, and that was the last message she'd sent Robert. She once again texted a friend about the pictures from their night out at around 1:02 a.m. After that, there was no more communication until all of Amie's friends started receiving messages that she'd been murdered. Robert Koshland had been one of many friends who arrived at the Los Angeles police station after hearing the news about Amie. Investigators wanted to know more about Amie and asked Robert if there was anyone who held a grudge against the therapist. Robert didn't hesitate and told officers that he believed they should take a closer look at 41-year-old Gareth Pursehouse. He was Amie's ex-boyfriend, and Robert said that Gareth was fully capable of harming Amie. Investigators wanted to learn more about Gareth and his relationship with Amie. There's not much known about Gareth Pursehouse, as he'd kept much of his personal life out of the media eye. He was born in 1978 in California to parents Paul and Barbara. He worked as a photographer in the adult entertainment industry and was also a software engineer and developer. He'd also tried his hand at stand-up comedy, but that career never really took flight. He was also a fan of Star Trek and often posted on social media about his personal thoughts. Amie and Gareth met in 2010 after being introduced to each other by a mutual friend named Grace Stanley. The couple hit it off immediately. By all standards, Gareth was considered handsome. Amie's friends found it odd that she'd date someone like Gareth, as she usually leaned towards men who were in the goth rock scene like her. However, she told them that she found him smart and interesting. But the cracks in the relationship started early. Amie's friends would tell investigators that Gareth was overly smitten, almost obsessed with Amie. Some friends went as far as to describe him as being bland and without an original personality. They also told investigators that after Amie had started dating Gareth, they'd hardly see her out and about, and he preferred keeping to himself. Amie, however, seemed to enjoy his attention and found it flattering. Within months, though, Amie had started to complain about Gareth to her friend circle. She'd started to become withdrawn, and when confronted by those that cared about her, Amie confessed that Gareth was hurting her both physically and emotionally. At first, she tried to get Gareth the help he needed, but when that didn't work, Amie ended the relationship in 2011. That was when the harassment began. Amie tried to take out a restraining order against Gareth, but without enough evidence to back her claim, the order was denied. A year after their split, Gareth broke into her house and destroyed her picture frames. He then started to tape roses to her front door and play music outside her house for hours on end. The final straw was when he attacked her on the freeway and assaulted her before abandoning her on the side of the road. Armed with proof this time around, Amie had filed 2 restraining orders against Gareth since they'd split in 2010. She was unsuccessful in the 2011 application, but in 2012, a judge finally granted the order against Gareth. The restraining order was placed on Gareth for 5 years, in which he was not allowed to have any contact with her whatsoever. However, Amie had gone on to achieve many milestones, but at each one there was a dark cloud. She could never really prove that Gareth was behind nasty online comments or horrible text messages and emails that she received, but she always had a feeling. Her engagement to Drew Carey in 2018 led to more harassment from her stalker, and that was what led to her ultimately ending her relationship with the comedian. According to friends, Amie had fallen into depression following the split, but by 2020, she was back and ready to take on the world once again. But Amie's new lease on happiness was to be short-lived. On January 17, 2020, Amie attended the XBiz Awards, an adult industry gala with her good friend Hernando Chavez. She was invited to be a panelist and representative as part of the organization Pineapple Support, which promotes proper mental health care for those working in the adult entertainment industry. While waiting in the queue to join the red carpet, Hernando went off to get drinks while Amie chatted away to friends. It was at this event she bumped into an all-too-familiar face, Gareth. He'd been hired to work as a photographer for the event and had called out to Amie to get her attention. He started to get angry, according to Amie's friend Aspen Jameson, and called her a hypocrite and accused Amie of ruining his life. Hernando said that Gareth had become verbally abusive, even though Amie had tried to calm the situation. Later that night, Gareth allegedly approached their table and tried to talk to Amie again, but he grew hysterical. Amie then met with Gareth after the show to speak with him again. When Hernando caught up with her so that they could ride back home together, he said that Amie appeared rattled. She explained to Hernando that Gareth had been quoting text messages she'd sent him from over 8 years earlier. As they drove home, both she and Hernando were constantly looking over their shoulders, watching to see if anyone was following them. After the event, Gareth had started texting Amie again, and the harassment continued for weeks. After that incident, both Hernando and Robert advised Amie about getting herself a security system installed and investing in a taser, pepper spray, or gun. Amie also decided to change the locks on all of her doors. In an ominous twist, Amie one day told Robert that if anything were to happen to her, he should tell the police that Gareth would be the person responsible. Armed with this information, investigators confronted Gareth at his home just 24 hours later. Gareth had been on a date and was about to leave the driveway of his home when he was arrested for suspicion of murder. Police took both him and his date down to the police station for questioning, while a second team searched through Gareth's house. Inside, they found a syringe similar to the one discovered in Amie's house, filled with a clear liquid. The syringe was sent in for testing. At the station, Gareth's date explained that they'd met through a dating app weeks earlier and had been chatting for a while. She said they'd agreed to spend the day together, but that Gareth seemed distant and withdrawn. She also told the police that she'd asked how he'd gotten the bruises on his face, and Gareth told her that he had a bicycle accident the day before. In the next room, Gareth denied his involvement in Amie's death and maintained that he injured himself during a bicycle accident. When confronted with his past restraining order and his history with Amie, he refused to speak. While being questioned, the results from the testing of the syringe arrived, and the liquid was a positive match to liquid nicotine found in the syringe discovered at Amie's house. Gareth was formally charged with murder and burglary on February 17, 2020, and held with bail set at $2 million at the county jail. He managed to pay his bail and was released. However, just a few days later, he was arrested and held without bail as he posed a flight risk. Investigators and prosecutors worked to build a solid case against Gareth. Apart from the witness testimonies and proof of restraining orders and harassment that Amie had against Gareth, they also worked on a special circumstance situation that proved Gareth was lying in wait for Amie in order to kill her. Investigators believe that the fateful meeting between Gareth and Amie in January 2020 led to his decision to ultimately murder the therapist. He'd been stalking her for days before the murder and was aware of her movements that evening. After she'd left home, he decided to make his move. Gareth had discovered the surveillance cameras and attempted fiddling with the device to disable the system or destroy evidence. He carried with him the syringe containing a lethal dose of liquid nicotine so that he could drug her. When Gareth arrived at Amie's house, he found that the locks were changed and opted to break in by smashing the window of the French door on the first level. He wasn't aware of Michael living with Amie at the time, and the fact that Michael ignored the sound of breaking glass added to his bravado. He waited in Amie's room, fully expecting her to return tired and perhaps slightly intoxicated from the show, so that he could easily subdue her and make her death look like an overdose or something natural. He did not expect for Amie to fight back, nor did he expect to hear someone else in the house. Investigators believe that Michael's disturbance led to Gareth throwing Amie over the balcony. He did this in order to escape without encountering any resistance from another person. The next day, he tried to cover up his bruising as an accident and tried to create an alibi with his date. Investigators also had the results of the autopsy that showed Amie had been strangled before being thrown from the balcony. They knew he had intended on killing her from the outset. Gareth remained behind bars until his trial began on August 29, 2023. However, one of his attorneys developed an illness and the trial was postponed until September 12, 2023. The prosecution team was led by Deputy District Attorney Victor Avila. In his opening statement, Avila outlined his entire argument based on Gareth's obsession with Amie and how, despite her every measure to protect herself, Gareth was still able to break down those defenses and murder her. Gareth's attorney, Evan Franzel, acknowledged that the red carpet run-in from January 2020 was what triggered Gareth's depression. However, in his argument, Franzel told the court that Gareth only wanted to talk to her and not kill her. Instead, Gareth had gone with the intention of ending his own life using the syringe with liquid nicotine on himself after speaking with Amie. The court heard testimony from friends of Amie. In opening arguments on August 29, 2023, Deputy District Attorney Victor Avila mentioned that DNA from blood collected from the crime scene matched Gareth's DNA and surveillance footage that placed Gareth at the scene of the crime. They were also presented with the text messages, emails, and voicemails, all left by Gareth in which he threatened Amie over the years. Gareth's defense team didn't provide any witnesses. Instead, they remained adamant that Gareth was innocent and that Amie had died while attempting to climb over the balcony to escape from Gareth. On September 28, 2023, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours over a period of 2 days before reaching a guilty verdict. They found that Gareth was guilty of first-degree murder, and under California law, he was given no possibility of parole. On December 6, 2023, Gareth was sentenced to life in prison. He currently remains in custody at the Los Angeles County Jail. For Amie's family and friends, her death has left a gaping wound in their lives. Her friends described her loss as being similar to having the sun ripped out from the sky. For Robert Koshland, he was pleased with the verdict and sentencing, but admitted nothing could prevent the pain of losing his best friend. Her friends have launched a petition called Justice for Amie in order to have Amie's law passed. They hoped that the introduction of this law would help update the current laws for victims of domestic violence. In drawing up the petition, they proposed that there should be tougher restrictions imposed on those that have restraining orders against them should they break contract. There was also the suggestion made for a stalker registry to be made available in all states and abolished the expiration dates imposed on restraining orders, only allowing for the orders to be lifted once the victim feels safe to live without its protection. For Drew Carey, Amie's ex-fiancé, her death left him overcome with grief. In an interview, he said that he still loved her and that they decided to meet after February 14, 2020 to talk, but he never did get the chance. Carey described his love for Amie as being something a person can only feel once in a lifetime. He described Amie as a positive force in the world and as a tireless and unapologetic champion for women who had passion and ambition. A fundraiser was organized by Amie's friends to have a bronze statue erected in Hollywood. The designer opted to have Amie dressed as Greek goddess Aphrodite, with her beloved cat Marquis de Chat at her side. The statue was to be erected as a monument to remember her passion for her work and would have a plaque dedicated to all women who have lost their lives due to domestic violence. Today's case has highlighted the dangers many women from around the world face: intimate partner violence. It's an epidemic that needs to be highlighted, and it's truly sad when people only take notice after it's too late. Despite her high-profile status, Amie herself suffered in silence, all the while trying to be a better person, only to meet a tragic end.
And I was scared. I didn't know what to do. So I turned around, I shot him. And I didn't stop shooting till the bullets ran out.
On July 29, 2020, a Louisiana state trooper pulled over a slick black and orange Chevrolet Camaro for speeding. But what started as a normal traffic stop turned into something far more sinister than the officer expected. The car was driven by 18-year-old Michael Mitchell Jr., who was heading toward Winsboro. When the officer asked him about his address and destination, Michael started fidgeting and failed to give any satisfactory answer.
So what's the address?
No.
What? You don't know your address?
No, sir.
Okay, come back here. Come back here.
The police officer persisted in his questioning, but when he realized that Michael wasn't cooperative at all, he decided to inspect the car himself. As he examined the windows, seats, trunk, and various places of the car, he realized that the car itself was holding many secrets. What kinds of secrets was this young boy hiding? Why did the state trooper continue to question him rather than give him a speeding ticket? Was he about to arrest this young boy? Louisiana is a state in the southern part of the United States. It shares borders with the states of Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi, while the Gulf of Mexico lies to the south. Ranking 25th in terms of population, the state has roughly 4.6 million residents. Louisiana has the classical subtropical climate of the south, with long hot summers and mild winters. A popular tourist attraction, the state is known for its jazz music and Creole and Cajun cuisine. It's also rich in salt mines and petroleum. The state has roughly 155,000 crimes per year, with a crime rate of 33 per 1,000 residents, which is quite high compared to the national average of 23. One of these crimes was discovered by chance during a routine traffic stop on Louisiana Highway 17 in 2020. On July 29, 2020, 18-year-old Michael Mitchell Jr. was driving toward Winsboro on LA 17 in a black and orange Chevrolet Camaro. He was speeding at 73 miles per hour in an area with a speed limit of 55 miles per hour, which put him in the radar of the Louisiana State Trooper Jesse Nielsen. Michael was immediately pulled over for questioning.
Hey, step back here with me, man. How are you? Hey, good afternoon. I'm Trooper Nielsen, Louisiana State Police. The reason why I stopped you was for speeding. You know how fast you're going?
No, sir.
73 and a 55, so it's 18 over the limit.
Michael claimed he was driving back home, but had forgotten to carry his driver's license or ID. He said the car belonged to his brother and he only drove it sometimes. Now, this wasn't an unusual scenario by any means, but what made Officer Nielsen doubtful was Michael's odd body language. He was extremely fidgety and his mannerisms seemed shady. things turned worse when Michael was asked where he lived. He hesitated and fished out his phone to show his home address in Winnsboro. But how could an 18-year-old not know his home address? Even if Michael was driving for the first time and required a GPS to navigate, he would definitely be able to recite his address from memory.
All right, where are you headed right now?
I was headed back home.
Okay. Where's home? What's your address? No, stop. Come here. Where do you live? It's easy. It's easy to answer this. Where do you live? You don't know how to drive to your house?
I was coming from there, how I got lost.
So what's the address?
No.
What? You don't know your address?
No, sir.
Okay, come back here.
Michael also denied being under the influence of any drugs, which made the whole thing stranger. Was this teenage boy trying to hide something? As the questioning continued at the side of the road, Michael gave little to no information to the officer about what he'd been doing prior to driving home or why he didn't know his own address. His vague answers compelled the officer to search the Camaro, and the results only made the situation murkier.
Come here. Put that phone on that hood. You know, you ain't gonna sit here and be texting behind my back while I'm sitting here in this car. Get on that car. All right, now, step here. When did all this happen? When did all that happen?
That happened.
When?
My brother, he said it.
How long ago?
like
Days? Okay, come back. Just leave this here. Come back here. Just stay right here in front of my car. Is this your wrench?
No, sir.
Officer Nielsen was expecting to find marijuana in the car since he thought he smelled it. He didn't find much in the initial search except for a cigarette and ashtray. But during a cursory scan of the car's exterior, the officer noticed 3 bullet holes near the driver's side window. When he asked Michael to explain the bullet holes, the boy said the marks were received days ago when his brother had been driving the car and that he didn't have any other information. While the conversation continued, Officer Nielsen contacted the Louisiana Police Department for some background research on the vehicle. He found out that Michael was not from Winnsboro like he claimed, but from Richwood.
Well, I just making sure. I mean, he's saying he lives down here in Winnsboro, but his address is coming back out of Richwood.
The scene changed when a random man who was driving by stopped at the commotion and called out to the officer, claiming to have recognized the Camaro. According to him, the car belonged to a young man named Michael Robinson Jr., who was reported missing 2 days ago in Monroe near Richwood. He handed over his phone to Officer Nielsen, saying the missing man's family was on the other end.
Yeah. Okay.
His family in Monroe is looking for him. They sent me out here.
Okay. All right. Well, I got somebody pulling up behind me, scooter. All right. Thank you, fella. Hey, now. Who are you?
They don't scare me to death.
Well, how are y'all here?
Cause my people from Monroe, that's him on the phone.
What do you mean they were looking for him?
They looking for him. The car missing. Hey.
Okay, give me the phone. Hey, man. Okay, what? His name is Mike. He's not giving that name though. He's given another name.
I got to go back to work.
What's your number, sir? His phone back.
Yeah, I got to go back to work.
Okay. He said he needs his phone back. I'll call you on a block line in a minute, okay?
Okay, I'll show thank you.
Okay, thank you.
When asked if he was from Richwood, Michael agreed and added he was going to Winnsboro to visit his sisters. But if the car belonged to Michael Robinson, why was the young man's name Michael Mitchell? Was he lying about his name? Or was there another Michael in the picture? Distrustful of the young driver's words, Officer Nielsen asked the department to locate the details about who the car really belonged to. After commanding Michael to stand in front of his car, Officer Nielsen decided to call back the person who was looking for Michael Robinson back in Monroe. From the conversation, and later by cross-checking with the Monroe Police Department, it emerged that a missing man named Michael Robinson Jr. actually owned the Camaro that Michael Mitchell Jr. was driving. When the officer found out that the missing owner of the car was from Monroe while Michael was from Richwood, he realized that Michael might be lying about more than one thing. Another Louisiana state officer joined Officer Nielsen to conduct a thorough search of the vehicle. While they discussed the bullet holes, Officer Nielsen decided to open the trunk of the car and was immediately taken aback by the sight that met him. Inside the Camaro's trunk was the lifeless body of a man with multiple bullet wounds in the chest. It looked like he was hastily shoved inside the trunk. The truly shocking thing was that 18-year-old Michael had been casually driving around with a dead body in the trunk and had continuously lied to the police. Officer Nielsen arrested Michael straight away before calling the police department to take over the case. The victim was identified as 23-year-old Michael Robinson Jr., also known as Mike, a graduating senior at Grambling State University. With his outstanding academic grades and an optimistic view about life, Mike wanted to become a state trooper himself after graduation. But tragically, his dream was ruthlessly cut short. When Michael was brought in for questioning, he immediately started describing what had happened. According to his statement, he and his friends had planned to rob Mike, who was quite rich. On the evening of July 28, 2020, the group decided to make a move after hanging out and smoking together. Michael insisted he had nothing to do with the actual crime or the shooting and was merely present at the scene when the burglary went wrong and ended in gunfire. He gave police a name, Cameron Powell, who was the chief mastermind. Michael claimed that when Cameron saw that Mike himself was armed, Cameron pulled out his Taurus 9 gun in self-defense and shot Mike 6 times. He then shoved the body into the trunk before driving away in Mike's black and orange Chevrolet Camaro.
After that, shots just came out, boom, boom, boom. Mike hit the ground. He was holding his stomach. He was like, "Bro, you shot me in my stomach." After that, he ran to the car because he knew Mike had a gun too. He went in there, grabbed Mike's gun. Mike was on the ground. He just did it to him, and that was it.
He did what to him?
He shot him in the head.
Okay.
After that, he was like, "Pop the trunk over here, pop the trunk." Pop the trunk. I just grabbed his legs, threw him in there. And after that, he took the car, and I was like, he took the car with the body, and I was gone.
Michael added that the next morning, Cameron had returned with the car and ordered Michael to get rid of both the body and the car. While driving to Winsboro to dump the body, he had been stopped by Officer Nielsen. Michael also named the other people involved in the murder. One of them was Smiley. But when the detectives questioned Smiley, he denied any knowledge. Instead, he claimed he and his friends Jay and Pat had heard gunshots and seen only Michael Mitchell Jr. with Mike Robinson Jr. when they arrived at the scene. But Michael insisted it was Cameron who shot Mike, and so Cameron Powell was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Right. So when I send this thing up the chain and I say, "Hey, Michael Mitchell didn't shoot this guy. He helped set him up. He needs his legs switched, but he didn't pull the trigger." Right?
Yes, sir.
Because that's what you want my report to say, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, to do that, I have to have all of my facts straight. But let me tell you what right now, I've got it on 2 recordings. Okay? I got one that says, Smiley was around the corner. He never saw me after the shooting. Me and Cam loaded the body up, and then Cam left in the car. Alright? Then I got Smiley saying, we heard the shooting, we drove around the corner, there was Michael Mitchell, no Cam. And you say, Cam was gone already. And then I got another story, just now, that me and Cam loaded up the body, he jumps in the car and leaves, and now you're just standing there?
Hey, look, Smiley has nothing to lose. Well, he has a lot to lose, but he's not involved. So he told us a story that makes sense, that's understandable.
Your story's the one it's not jive.
The court trial for Cameron and Michael was scheduled for August 29, 2022. But after evidence emerged that cast doubts on Michael's statements, the district attorney's office filed a declination form on Cameron's behalf on August 3rd. This form stated their willingness to explore other possibilities and leads in the investigation. As a result, the Ouachita Parish Courthouse postponed the sentencing to October 13, 2022. Cameron was initially charged with second-degree murder, even though he maintained he was innocent. In subsequent interrogations, Michael finally broke and dropped the truth, confirming the detective's suspicions. Michael confessed that he was the only one involved in the armed robbery that led to Mike's death. He had shot 6 bullets in self-defense when Mike tried to shoot him.
Me and Mike, we was chilling for a few hours, like, so after that, he had texted me, he was like, yeah, send me a few dollars for some gas, so I can go get some gas. Went to go get some gas. He left. He told me that's what he was finna do, so that's what he did. And after he was finished, he told me he was back over there.
So Smiley went, got gas, hung out, whatever, for like 4 hours. And then he texted you back and said that he's back at the spot, which is the same spot y'all were smoking at earlier in the night, with Pat and Jay.
Yeah.
Okay. And right now you're still with Mike.
I'm still with Mike at this point.
Go from there. What happened after that?
So after that, we left the apartment. So I was like, hey, bro, I'm ready to go home. And Mike, he was like, he was looking kind of frustrated at that. Like, he was like blowing his breath out. He was like, all right. Through the car and park, he was being kind of aggressive.
Where were you at right now?
At this point, we was leaving the apartments.
Y'all were driving?
Yeah,
okay.
Pulling out of the apartments. And he was going super fast. Hitting the corners all lit. Because when you leave the apartment, if you go make a left, then there would be the long street, the dark street, right there. So I was getting out. He pulled around with the car facing, like, the car would be facing the opposite way that we came. So you can, like, drive straight off. So at that point, I was getting out the car, like, all right, Mike, bro, I'ma fuck with you. Like, saying goodbye, really. And then Mike was standing, at that point, he was standing at the car. He was, like, posted up on the car, like I told y'all. Mike, I turned around. Mike had his gun in his hand. Like, he was, like, drawing it towards me. And I was scared. I didn't know what to do. So I turned around. I shot him. And I need to stop shooting till the bullets ran out.
Okay, this is a step in the right direction, okay? Getting it off your chest.
Oh, look at right here, man. I'm on 18.
Well, let's go to another real side point. Did Cameron have anything to do with this? So Cameron is totally innocent.
Where did you come up with Cameron?
You
don't like him, or
he jacked me for some money. He jacked me for a large amount of money a while back. Like,
that's it.
But yeah, it was at gunpoint. But yeah,
so Cameron robbed you one time.
Yeah, he
at
robbed
gunpoint.
He also added that he'd falsely blamed Cameron as an act of revenge for an earlier incident when Cameron had drugged and robbed Michael. In the light of this confession, Cameron was cleared of all charges. Michael was initially charged with second-degree murder, but following a trial, his charges were reduced to manslaughter. While specific details of the trial proceedings aren't known, Michael was eventually sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. Mike's family mourned his death as they came together to pray for his soul. When he went missing, we knew something was wrong because that's not like him, said Adrian Harris, Mike's cousin. As a community, we've been fighting hard to fight racial inequality with the Black Lives Matter movement, and it just sucks when we lose a life to one of our own. On August 4th, 2020, friends and family of Mike held a balloon release at Carroll High School to honor him. While his family struggles with the loss every day, they hope Mike's soul is resting in peace now. Today's case is truly a twisted and disturbing one. Even though Michael was arrested, the way he broke down while confessing made some people believe that he was remorseful for what he did. Michael may have shot Mike, but he was equally terrified that night when Mike tried to shoot him first, implying that a grave mistake was made in the heat of the moment. As unsettling as it was, the outcome for both families was quite tragic.
Hello, I'm a short break foster carer for a child. He's not been able to be dropped off at his own house because his grandparents are not answering the door. I've just been round the back and I've seen his grandfather, and he appears to have a gun in his hand.
The morning of July 4th, 2012 began as a typical day for the residents of Sale, Greater Manchester in England. 68-year-old Robert Seddon and his wife of 47 years, Patricia, were preparing for another day of tending the garden and enjoying each other's company. The couple were known for their morning gardening routine. Robert was a retired British Airways employee, and Patricia was retired from state service. However, the next day, the neighbors couldn't find them, and they also noticed that they hadn't tended the garden as per their routine. It was as if they'd disappeared. What happened to Robert and Patricia Seddon? Did they just disappear, or is there a more troubling reason behind their disappearance? Sale is a town in Trafford, Greater Manchester, England. As of the last sentence of 2021, Sale was home to around 54,000 people. The arrival of the Bridgewater Canal in 1765 kick-started the town's development. Sale truly blossomed with the advent of the railway in 1849, becoming a key transportation hub for folks traveling to and from Manchester. This led to an influx of middle-class residents, tripling the town's population by the end of the 19th century. Residents of Sale are friendly and welcoming people. In 2012, crime decreased by nearly 10%, as reported by the Greater Manchester Police, with violent crime going down by 18%. This was the town where Stephen and Patricia Seddon lived. Robert Seddon was born in 1945, and his wife Patricia was born in 1948. They fell in love at a young age and quickly got married in 1965. 2 years later, in 1967, they welcomed a baby, Stephen Seddon, and later his younger sister Leslie. Robert and Patricia worked hard to provide a modest but comfortable life for their family. It was a warm and loving home overall. Robert and Patricia had been married for more than 45 years, a testament to their enduring love and commitment to one another. As their eldest son, Stephen, approached his teenage years, he developed a keen interest in business and entrepreneurship. He was drawn to the idea of creating something out of nothing, and this passion led him to set up a consultancy firm in the 1990s. Stephen's consultancy firm specialized in helping small businesses secure European and British business grants. This venture proved successful, gaining £5 million in revenue. However, the success of the business came from misleading small firms with false promises, which ultimately led to Stephen's incarceration for fraud in 2000. Despite his past legal troubles and financial difficulties, Stephen Seddon had once tasted the high life. He was frequently seen driving around in his Bentley Turbo and jetting around the world on luxury trips. After serving his 1-year sentence for fraud, Stephen found work as a car salesman. Still, his financial situation was far from stable, and he relied on his parents for assistance. He was unemployed and his bank account held only £5, a stark contrast to his earlier life of luxury. However, his parents were committed to ensuring that he was stable financially, so they gifted him £40,000 in cash and purchased a £90,000 home from in Seaham, County Durham, in the northeast of England. Although Stephen had been in prison for fraud, his thirst for money hadn't changed. The Seddon family faced a significant tragedy when their daughter, Leslie, passed away in September 2008 at the age of 40. This unfortunate event left Stephen's parents with the responsibility of caring for Leslie's disabled son, Daniel, who became a part of their household. On March 20th, 2012, Stephen hired a BMW and drove from his home to the northeast to Manchester to treat his parents to a surprise meal as a sort of belated Mother's Day present. With his parents and nephew Daniel in the hired car, Stephen drove along a stretch of road beside the Bridgewater Canal in Timperley, south of Manchester, when suddenly the vehicle hit a rock, swerved off the road, and sank into the water.
Hello. Hi, I'm driving up Canal Road in Timperley, Manchester, and a car has just driven into the canal.
Okay. Is anybody inside, can you tell?
Well, no one's got out. They literally drove towards me and they sort of didn't stop and then they veered off and gone into the canal.
During this terrifying event, Daniel managed to free himself and reach safety. However, Stephen was spotted on top of the car, attempting to break the windows and seemingly crying out for help. However, witnesses who rushed to assist quickly realized that Stephen's actions might be making the car sink further and asked him to come down. Their intervention was crucial in saving Mrs. Seddon's life, with one brave firefighter showing immense heroism and performing emergency CPR on her at the scene. Stephen was hailed as a hero for saving his parents' lives and even appeared on the cover of the local newspaper as a hero. On July 5, 2012, neighbors of the Seddons noticed that they hadn't seen them since the evening the previous day and became concerned. Having lived at the house for a long time, the Seddons had a reputation of often being outside, usually tending to their garden. The concerned neighbors quickly called the police.
Police attended the address and the scene they were met with was Pat laying in the hallway with an obvious shotgun blast to the head. Bob himself was in the rear lounge, slouched on the couch with a clear shotgun injury to his chest and a double-barrel sawn-off shotgun lay across his lap.
When the police arrived, they noticed that the Seddons' house wasn't locked. Shockingly, inside, they discovered the dead bodies of Robert and Patricia. The police also found a sawn-off shotgun in Robert's lap. From the scene, it appeared that Robert had shot his wife and ended his life with the sawn-off shotgun.
Hello, I'm a short-break foster carer for a child. He's not been able to be dropped off at his own house because his grandparents are not answering the door. I've just been round the back and I've seen his grandfather and he appears to have a gun in his hand.
The police were determined to find out what had happened and why the Seddons, who were known as friendly, modest, and comfortable, would want to end their lives. However, forensic experts soon determined that it was impossible for Robert to have taken his own life in the manner in which he was discovered. His arm length and the recoil from the shotgun made it quite unlikely that he shot himself with the weapon resting in his lap.
6 expert pathologists at the scene were able to establish that the shot that killed Bob wasn't a shot he fired himself. The reason for this is that the size of the shot pattern on his chest indicated that the weapon must have been at least 1.5 meters away from him at the time the round was fired.
This discovery led to the launch of a double murder investigation, and Stephen was called in for questioning. Although there was little concrete evidence to directly link Stephen to pulling the trigger, he made a critical mistake by confiding in a few individuals about an impending substantial inheritance. His parents' estate was valued at £230,000, and they'd made their wills in October 2009, naming each other as beneficiaries in case one of them passed away. However, the will specified that in the event that they both died, their son, Stephen, would get the whole estate. This revelation showed that he had a motive for killing his parents. The day before the tragic deaths of Mr. Robert and his wife Patricia, Robert had scheduled appointments with his general practitioner. According to Peter Wright QC, the prosecutor, Mr. Robert had previously believed that the canal incident was an accident. However, during this visit to his general practitioner, he expressed concerns that his son had actually attempted to end his and his wife's lives by driving into the canal. Mr. Robert also informed the doctor that he intended to confront his son regarding this matter. Around 5:30 a.m. on July 4th, 2012, Stephen and his wife, Nicholas Stockton, and their children were at a carnival park in Fleetwood, Lancashire. His father owned a static caravan there, which the family often used for holidays. Stephen then drove back to see him in his VW Passat to complete some paperwork at the benefits office. While there, he exchanged his own car for a borrowed BMW, which belonged to his brother-in-law, Robert Stockton Jr. Throughout the day, 2 calls were made from Stephen's mobile phone to a man named Brian Jopper who lived in Darlington. Jopper had a history of criminal convictions, including serious offenses involving firearms. Stephen's mobile phone remained in the CM area and received 2 calls from loan companies trying to reach him. On both occasions, Stephen's nephew, Lee Stockton, answered the phone. The BMW's movements were tracked by police using automatic number plate recognition systems and various CCTV cameras. It was observed traveling from Seam across the country and south to the northwest. At 1:33 p.m., the CCTV footage captured the BMW driving near his parents' residence in Sale. Just 26 minutes later, the same camera recorded the car leaving on the same route, allegedly after Stephen had fatally shot his parents. Disturbingly, the police uncovered that Stephen had brought along 3 shotgun cartridges, unaware that his disabled nephew was away in respite care on that fateful day, sparing him from the killer's intentions. After the shooting, Stephen had cunningly staged the crime scene, positioning the gun in his father's lap and manipulating his right hand to create the appearance of a murder-suicide. As a result, the police began to re-examine the previous car accident near the canal. It turned out that he'd first tried to take his father Robert and mother Patricia out in a planned car accident. With his parents secured in the back seat of a rental car, Stephen deliberately drove the vehicle into a canal, making it look like an accident. However, his plan failed, and instead of carrying out his evil plan, he had to switch roles and act like a hero when bystanders rushed to their rescue. After being rescued from the water, the police interviewed him to find out what happened. However, Stephen provided varying accounts of what had transpired. He told one set of investigators that he had a heart attack and lost consciousness momentarily, and he told another set that the car hit a rock and flew into the canal. However, no signs of a heart attack were seen by the doctors in the hospital, and no rocks were near the canal.
Stephen's varying explanations about why the crash had happened, his heart condition that couldn't be detected, his added insurance on the car that was ultimately going to wind up in the canal. This all strongly pointed to the fact that Stephen had, in March that year, tried to kill his family by driving them into the canal.
In fact, when the police informed Stephen of his parents' murders, his immediate response was, "What am I going to do now? I'm going to lose the house. The mortgage is in my dad's name." Despite the investigations, Stephen vehemently denied the shooting allegations, considering it ridiculous to suggest that he'd attempted to kill his own mother and father. He also found it sickening to imply that he'd intended to harm his nephew. Eventually, Stephen Seddon was charged with 2 counts of murder and attempted murder. Following a 5-week trial at Manchester Crown Court, Stephen Seddon was found guilty by the jury of 2 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of murder. The Seddon's family in the public gallery expressed relief and emotion with cries of yes upon hearing the verdicts. During the sentencing, Judge Nicholas Hamblin described Stephen's involvement in a continuum of crime culminating in the cold-blooded killing of a quiet, unassuming, elderly couple in their own home. Stephen protested his innocence in court, but the judge advised him to remain silent. According to Peter Wright QC, the prosecutor, Stephen took a more direct method to ensure his parents' death since the canal accident didn't work. The jury was informed that Stephen Seddon was the sole beneficiary of his parents' wills and had a strong motive for their murder. He was grappling with financial difficulties and had an insatiable desire for money at the time of the murders. Being the sole heir to their wills, he needed both of his parents to be deceased to inherit. It was only after the couple's deaths that the police uncovered Seddon's financial problems and realized that the canal incident was not a tragic accident, but an earlier attempt on their lives. During the sentencing, the judge, Mr. Justice Hamblin, said that Stephen's parents suffered greatly from his attempt to kill them. From his first staged accident to the eventual murder, they faced a horrifying ordeal that threatened their lives and left them with nightmares, depression, stress, and insomnia. The judge, Mr. Hamblin, pointed out that the motive behind these crimes was pure greed. He highlighted Stephen's financial difficulties, job loss, mortgage, and his desire to realize ambitious plans immediately. Despite his parents' history of supporting him generously, he wanted more, which led to the plan to kill them and claim his inheritance up front. In his statement, Mr. Justice Hamblin told Stephen that he essentially executed his own parents. He described the unimaginable horror of the parents' final moments when they realized what their own son, whom they'd loved, had become. Thankfully, their deaths were swift. The jury delivered majority verdicts on all 4 charges after 18 hours and 11 minutes of deliberation. Upon hearing the verdicts, Stephen visibly shook his head while his murdered parents' family in the public gallery could be heard sobbing. In response, his barrister, Toby Hedworth QC, contended that the case did not warrant a whole life tariff, which would condemn Stephen to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. Mr. Hedworth acknowledged that the murders were indeed aggravated by the use of a firearm, the fact that 2 vulnerable elderly citizens were involved, the abuse of a position of trust, and the pursuit of financial gain. Stephen received a life sentence for the murders with a minimum term of 40 years and a concurrent sentence of 20 years for the attempted murders. After the sentencing, relatives of Mr. and Mrs. Seddon, in a statement read by the police, expressed the deep sadness and emotional turmoil their family had experienced. They remembered the couple as kind, loving, and selfless, underlining the void left by their horrifying and tragic loss. On August 25, 2021, 33-year-old Cassidy Rainwater was reported missing by a family member after being unreachable for over a month. She was last seen boarding a truck with a man. The police searched left and right, but couldn't find any answers. In fact, just 14 years earlier, Cassidy's own mother, 43-year-old Tracy Wawasuk, had gone missing when she went arrowhead hunting in Lebanon, east of Windyville. The investigation went on, but neither of the women returned. So, how did 2 family members disappear? Was it merely a coincidence, or was there one face behind both the disappearances? Cassidy's story takes us to a tiny unincorporated community called Windyville in Dallas County, Missouri. The area is named after the windy nature of its densely forested environment, but locals in the surrounding towns consider Windyville a creepy place, with reports of it being haunted. Windyville is also the location of the controversial School of Metaphysics. According to the 2020 census, Windyville only housed 54 residents, most of them female. The annual crime rate is estimated to be 25.29 per 1,000 residents, which is a remarkably high number considering the very low population. In the last 20 years, Windyville has witnessed a drastic decline in population, a drop of 67%. After the chilling crime that rocked the place in July 2021, many other residents are rethinking their decision to settle there. Cassidy Rainwater's case has unlocked a deep sense of fear in the small community. Cassidy Rainwater was born on June 9, 1988, to Tracy Wawasuk. Cassidy spent most of her early years in Missouri with her mother. Her father probably wasn't present in their lives, especially as she took the name Rainwater, which was Tracy's maiden name. Cassidy attended Harrisonville High School in Missouri, where friends described her as a wild one who loved to sing. At the age of 16, Cassidy met a much older man named Benjamin Michael Harrison. They began dating despite their age gap and welcomed a child in 2005. Shortly after that, Cassidy realized that Ben was an abuser. She was granted a protection order from Ben on September 14, 2005, and a year later, she sued him for child support. The judge in the case awarded her $224 per month for the baby. However, being a mother at such a young age began to take a toll on Cassidy, and she had to put her child up for adoption months later. On top of that, Cassidy also lost her mother Tracy in suspicious circumstances. On April 13, 2007, 43-year-old Tracy was reported missing by her partner Leonard Major Couch. She was last seen in Lebanon, east of Windyville, where Leonard claimed she'd gone in search of arrowheads. All attempts to find her proved futile. A year later, a farmer came across a lone shoe that contained human remains, including a set of teeth. DNA testing confirmed that the remains were Tracy's. However, the case was closed and no suspects were arrested or charged. Even her partner Leonard was never interrogated, despite Tracy's remains being found quite close to his home. Cassidy was torn between the sorrow of parting from her child and the grief over her mother's death. In her vulnerability, she went through a string of relationships, all with problematic men. She had a child with a man named Stephen Keeney, who was later arrested and sentenced for assaulting an underage relative. Cassidy then had a short-lived marriage with Zachary Lee Paul, who also had a criminal background. They had one child together before splitting up, and she placed their child in the custody of a relative in 2021. The names of these children and several other people related to Cassidy aren't mentioned to protect their identity. Unfortunately, Cassidy's tragic life eventually followed a similar path to her mother's, when in 2021, at the age of 33, she suddenly went missing. On August 25, 2021, a family member named Cora Terry reported Cassidy missing to the police after she couldn't be contacted for over a month. Cora was the relative who had Cassidy's child in her custody, and she'd been trying to contact Cassidy after she didn't visit her child for several weeks. Cora had last seen Cassidy in late July, leaving in a GMC truck with a man named James Phelps. This was 6 weeks before the missing person report was made. Deputy Chris Clark from the Dallas County Sheriff's Office visited Phelps's home at 386 Moon Valley Road in Windyville that same day. He met Phelps, a 58-year-old man who claimed that Cassidy had moved to Colorado. With no further leads regarding Cassidy's whereabouts, the police returned to Phelps's home on September 1, 2021 for follow-up questions. Phelps claimed Cassidy had been living with them for a while as she tried to get back on her feet after a failed marriage. He also claimed that in late July, Cassidy had left his home after getting into some unidentified person's car and driving away into the night. He couldn't describe the person or the car, yet Phelps insisted that Cassidy had moved to Colorado to start a new life. Sergeant Rob Simmons, who led the questioning, found Phelps's claims suspicious. A tour around the house further unsettled the officer, giving him the eerie feeling that something strange had happened. But without evidence, Sergeant Simmons had no choice but to leave. His suspicion was confirmed 2 weeks later when the Federal Bureau of Investigation received an anonymous cyber tip on September 16, 2021. The whistleblower sent a file named Cassidy, which contained several pictures of the missing woman half undressed in a cage and bound to a gantry crane. The FBI Missouri headquarters determined that the location was in Windyville and sent the pictures to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. That same day, police officers swarmed the cabin and arrested Phelps. They got a warrant and proceeded to search Phelps's home for a period of 7 days. Evidence gathered on the scene included a human-sized cage and a gantry crane, along with traces of blood. Worryingly, skeletal remains were found at an adjacent property. The police discovered that this property belonged to Cassidy's grandfather, Bill Rainwater, which raised questions about Phelps's claim that Cassidy was homeless. But the most shocking discovery was in Phelps's freezer. Police found a vacuum-sealed package of odd-looking meat, which was later determined to be human flesh. The package was labeled 7/24, the same date around when Cassie had disappeared. With these discoveries, investigations into Phelps's House of Horrors began in earnest. While detectives continued to unearth evidence at the site, Phelps remained tight-lipped, refusing to answer questions. On September 17, 2021, he invoked his right to legal counsel. However, Phelps's phone contained information that pointed to the involvement of another man in Cassidy's disappearance. More than a month before his arrest, Phelps had been exchanging messages with a 56-year-old man named Timothy Norton. The texts outlined a chilling plan to overpower Cassidy, who Phelps claimed was stealing items from him while she lived in his home. Norton was promptly arrested on September 19, 2021. Unlike Phelps, Norton began to confess his role in the events that led to Cassidy's disappearance. Norton admitted that he and Phelps had mulled over the plan for a month before carrying it out on the fateful night of July 24, 2021. Norton, who was living on Phelps's property, had come to the house at midnight when Cassidy was asleep. He held Cassidy by the leg while Phelps suffocated her with a plastic bag over her head. When Cassidy stopped struggling and the men were sure she was dead, Phelps went ahead to hang Cassidy on a gantry crane in his backyard. The equipment was the smaller kind used for processing wild game like deer. Norton said he watched as Phelps eviscerated Kathy while her body hung on the crane. Phelps took several pictures during the whole process. Both men then packed Cassidy's remains into a bathtub where Phelps dismembered her. Norton's account supported the forensic evidence found on Phelps's property. DNA testing determined that the blood particles, skeletal remains, and frozen flesh were a match for Cassidy. The label 7/24 was the same date when Norton said they'd killed Cassidy. Cassidy's tragic fate was finally clear to investigators a month after she disappeared. While both men were awaiting trial in prison, police were faced with another perplexing situation. In the early hours of October 4, 2021, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office received emergency calls for a fire at 386 Moon Valley, which was Phelps's property. By the time police and firefighters arrived, most of the property had burned and collapsed. An officer discovered an explosive made of mortar tubes, tripwire, and balloon covers, which they assumed had triggered the fire. Fearing a bigger explosion, the bomb squad was quickly called. Rachel Wilson, a neighbor who witnessed the incident, said the fire occurred suddenly and the house collapsed soon after. We could feel the heat. Everything was on fire, and we sat there and watched it collapse. I called 911 because I was worried about it catching the woods on fire and spreading to other houses. On further investigation, it was determined that the cause of the fire was arson with a possible intent to destroy the crime scene. This incident raised even more suspicion in the small Windyville community. Both suspects were already in jail, and authorities had even separated them into different facilities to prevent collusion. It was therefore baffling that someone had sought to destroy evidence and hinder the police's efforts to prosecute Cassidy's killers. Rumors and speculations began to fly around the community as the investigation lingered for weeks while the police tried to protect sensitive information. Someone claimed that Phelps had once offered a neighbor human ribs. There were unconfirmed reports that when Phelps was arrested, he was eating a burger containing human meat. Rumors of a cannibal ring in the area began to spread to neighboring communities. Fearing mass hysteria, the police had to release a statement on social media debunking some of the claims and assuring residents that a thorough investigation was still going on. On November 17, 2021, Phelps and Norton were formally charged in court. Their original charges of kidnapping and corpse abandonment were upgraded to include first-degree murder following the evidence unearthed in Phelps's home. Phelps and Norton's relationship spanned decades of friendship, extending even to their families. Both men led lives that could be regarded as exemplary in the early years, so their crimes caused deep shock to their family and longtime friends. James David Phelps was born in 1963 and mostly grew up in Preston, Missouri. He attended Skyline High School, where he met Norton, who was 2 years his junior. Phelps was on the honor roll multiple times as a high schooler. After his graduation, he joined the U.S. Army and was stationed in South Carolina. He got married in 2009 and moved back to Missouri, but eventually got divorced. He had a daughter and 3 grandchildren. His criminal background was surprisingly non-violent compared to the gruesome crime of Cassidy's murder. He had a history of bad checks, some fines for illegal fishing and hunting, and a couple of lawsuits with landlords. Even more surprising, Phelps was ordained as a minister by God of the Universal Life Church in 2019, just 2 years before his arrest. Similarly, Norton had sparse run-ins with law enforcement before his arrest in 2021. He was born in 1965 in Cromwell, Minnesota, and later moved to Missouri. He did part of his schooling at Hermitage High, where he was an honor roll student. He then moved to Skyline High School, where he met Phelps. Norton joined the Marines after high school and relocated to Millington, Tennessee, where he undertook a helicopter training course. He was considered a hero who led an exemplary life and made the small community proud. This notion quickly changed as details of Cassidy's murder emerged. While both men took different paths in life, they ultimately kept in touch due to the closeness of their families. In 1992, Norton began using Phelps's Moon Valley home as his address, even though he lived in different places afterward. At the time of his arrest, the lot still remained his listed address. The preliminary hearing was held in October 2021. Both men appeared via video conference from the different facilities where they were being held. While the men were charged together, their trials were conducted separately. Phelps had applied to be released from detention on November 19, 2021, but prosecutor Jonathan Barker argued against this application, telling Judge John Porter that Phelps and Norton posed risks to public safety and might attempt to flee. Barker told the court that Norton had confessed to searching for potential victims online and at Walmart stores who could be lured to their location and killed. Barker also told the court that the men were especially interested in preying on young teenage girls. As a result, the judge denied Phelps's bail. In February 2022, Norton was arraigned at the Dallas County Courthouse through video conference. His defense attorney, Brandon Tweebell, entered a plea of not guilty. During the trial, it emerged that Norton possessed several videos of disturbing and explicit content featuring minors. In July 2022, Phelps was arraigned at the Dallas County Courthouse. He was represented by public defender Thomas Jacquinot, who also entered a plea of not guilty. Jacquinot also filed a request to change the trial venue to Jasper County, which was approved. Knowing that the prosecution would be seeking the death penalty, Phelps changed his not guilty plea and entered an Alford plea in April 2023 before his trial began. The Alford plea is made when a defendant admits there's enough evidence for a guilty verdict from the jury, but does not actually admit to the crime. As a result, Phelps avoided the death penalty and was instead sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. 2 months after Phelps' sentencing, Norton also changed his initial not guilty stance and pled guilty to the charges against him. He was similarly sentenced to life imprisonment without parole on June 27, 2023. After his trial, Norton admitted that his crime was heinous and that things just regrettably went out of control the night Cassidy was killed. "I deserve to die, and I'm ready for that," he said in an interview. Their trial and sentencing was a welcome development to the Dallas County community, which had been horrified by the gruesomeness of the case. Residents felt that Phelps and Norton deserved to be behind bars for the rest of their lives. They also expressed sympathy for Cassidy's family, who had to lose their loved one in such an unimaginable way. The prosecution noted that Cassidy's family, including her children and their guardians, had desired to stay away from the press as much as possible in order to grieve privately. Notably, family members of Phelps and Norton also maintained a safe distance, not wanting to be associated in any way with their twisted crime. Despite the sentencing, some residents of Windyville have been unable to get past the gory crime. They're reconsidering their decision to settle there and might decide to move away for good. Cassidy Rainwater's case continues to fuel speculation, especially since no arrests were ever made for the arson at Phelps' property while the men were in prison. Could another person be involved in this crime who tried to cover their own tracks by burning down the crime scene? On March 4th, 2008, a young couple from Budgeree, Australia suddenly disappeared while out on a picnic, leaving no traces behind. This young couple was 22-year-old Julian Matthias Buchwald and 17-year-old Carolynne Watson, who were headed to a beautiful spot near Julian's house for a romantic date on that fateful day. Concerned when they didn't return home till 3 p.m., Julian's mother decided to call the police. An extensive search ensued, but there were no signs of the couple. However, chilling secrets were about to emerge as police dug deeper into the disappearance. When they found hints about the possible involvement of a satanic cult, all the family members could do was to pray that Julian and Carolynne would return home safely. Where did the couple disappear to so suddenly? Did they decide to run away from home, or were there much darker motives beneath the surface? Budgeree is a rural locality in the state of Victoria in southeastern Australia. The name Budgeree is believed to be taken from an Aboriginal word that means a good place. The area was initially settled for farming purposes in the late 1800s and began to flourish from dairy and creamery industries. However, the land was hilly and unsuitable, and eventually the farms were abandoned. Since then, the population of Budgeree has sharply declined. In 2011, 348 people lived in the town, but by 2016, that number had fallen to just 129. It's no surprise then that the crime rate in Budgeree is well below the national average. It's safer than 72% of all Australian suburbs. As a result, when the disappearance and suspected kidnapping of Carolynne and Julian occurred in 2008, residents of the small community were shocked to their core. 22-year-old Julian Buchwald and 17-year-old Carolynne Watson had been dating for 2 years and were madly in love. Julian lived with his family in Budgeree, while Carolynne lived in the nearby small town of Churchill. Julian's family owned 1,200 acres of forested land in Budgeree, which was the perfect place for the young couple to spend time together and explore nature. Julian and Carolynne were really serious about their relationship and wanted to get married. They came from devoutly Christian families and had first met each other at church. They even discussed their wedding plans with the local pastor. On March 4th, 2008, Julian had planned a cute picnic lunch date for Carolynne. Their destination was a spot on Julian's family land, which had a beautiful waterfall and perfect scenery. It was a pleasant morning when Julian picked Carolynne up from her house, then grabbed the picnic baskets and blankets from his home, before setting off on the date. The waterfall they were planning to visit was a few kilometers away from Julian's parents' home, but it was a familiar place that the couple had visited before. Julian drove his SUV, confident of the path to take. The drive started out as peaceful and ordinary, as the duo enjoyed each other's company. However, after driving for some minutes, Julian saw something odd by the side of the road. It was the carcass of an animal. The couple continued down the road, but Julian couldn't take his mind off from the carcass. Keen to inspect the animal himself, he stopped the car at a safe spot. This was nothing new. Julian would often stop to examine things that caught his eye, so Carolynne stayed back in her seat while Julian walked back to the carcass. They'd driven a bit ahead by then, so the walk back was quite long. Soon, Julian disappeared from Carolynne's sight. When 10 minutes had passed, Carolynne decided to call Julian to check on him. Right when she was about to dial his number, something unsettling caught her eye in the rearview mirror. A mysterious hooded figure was approaching the car from the direction where Julian had walked away. The figure was covered from head to toe in black clothing and was wearing gloves and a balaclava. Before Carolynne could lock the car door, the figure had already reached the vehicle and yanked open the passenger door. Carolynne was dragged out and pushed to the ground. In a panic, she tried to scream, but felt her mouth being duct-taped by the stranger. Then her hands were tied. Gagged and bound, she was tossed into the back seat of the car, and in rising terror, she felt the SUV starting to move. After driving for quite some time, the vehicle came to a halt. The stranger started to drag Carolynne out once again. She immediately scanned the surroundings, but realized with a sinking feeling that she was not at all familiar with the place. All around her were densely populated woods. Her ordeal turned more sinister as the hooded figure cut off all her clothes with a knife before starting to dig a hole a few feet away from where she lay on the ground. Terrified that she was about to be violated and then murdered, she did the only thing she was capable of. She began to pray. It didn't take long for Julian and Carolynne's family to realize that the couple had been gone way longer than usual for their date sessions. When the duo didn't return home by 3 p.m., Julian's mother started to worry. She paced in her front yard, hoping to see her son's SUV pulling up at any minute. It was then that she noticed something extremely unusual. A bottle with a note placed inside it was hanging from one of the wired fences of the property. Finding it quite strange, she decided to pull the bottle free from the fence and read the writing on the paper inside. But the contents of the letter horrified her. The note was seemingly written by the kidnapper and contained excessive profanity. It claimed that Julian and Carolynne had been abducted for some kind of a ritual and warned against involving the police under any circumstances. Otherwise, they would meet their deaths in the worst way possible. 10 days before this incident, Carolynne's father had also received a threatening note warning him to be careful and not try to mess with the people who didn't stand the faith of God. It made threats against his family, especially his daughter Carolynne. But when he reported the matter to the police, they dismissed his concerns, saying that it was likely some harmless prank. But now that Carolynne hadn't returned home from her date, her family began to fear the worst. Despite the warning to not call the police, Julian's mother alerted the cops as panic struck her. The police rushed to the spot, and realizing the severity of the situation, they immediately launched a search through the Buchwald family property. Police knew that combing through the thick woods would be tough, but they still thoroughly scouted the 1,200 acres of land owned by Julian's parents, looking for any clues about Julian and Carolynne. But even after several hours, the police found no trace of the couple, nor any sign of Julian's car. The police then shifted focus to the threatening notes that both the families had received. Handwriting experts were called in, and they declared that both the notes were written by the same person. But neither the couple nor their families were known to have any enemies. In fact, they were quite involved in the community and local church. A closer look at the notes revealed a clue. It implied that the writer was part of some group that considered Christians as their enemies. And not only that, both notes had a strange hand-drawn symbol. After studying the strange symbol, police determined that it was related to a satanic cult called Order of Nine Angles. Originally established in the 1960s in the United Kingdom, the cult had branched out to many different countries in the 1980s due to its ideology and activism. The order advised its followers to isolate themselves from people, commit crimes, and also indulge in human sacrifice. This last detail cast a sinister shadow on the investigation, as police speculated that Julian and Carolynne might become the victims of some satanic sacrifice. The police refused to lose hope and continued to search for the duo. But days passed with no signs of Julian and Carolynne. Police believed that the survival chances of the couple were really low, even if they weren't sacrificed or had escaped the cult. The woods were full of venomous and deadly insects and reptiles. Plus, there had been harsh changes in the day and nighttime temperatures that week. The couple had dressed lightly and only taken their picnic baskets. With no warm clothes or extra food supplies, surviving in those forests would be tough. And so, with heavy hearts, the search for Julian and Carolynne slowly shifted from finding and bringing them home to merely just finding their bodies. 6 whole days after the couple disappeared, police finally had a breakthrough, which brought relief to the families, but also puzzled the investigators. Julian and Carolynne were alive. They'd been spotted near Alpine National Park and picked up by a farmer driving by who noticed they needed help. Now the police understood why their search through the woods had been futile. Alpine National Park was hundreds of miles away from Julian's house or the waterfall for the planned picnic. It was roughly a 6-hour drive away. The couple was immediately sent to the hospital. Though there were multiple cuts and bruises on their bodies, they were otherwise okay with no severe injuries. The Buchwald and Watson families shed tears of relief at being reunited with their children. Despite the happy resolution, police were worried about the threatening letters. They decided to interview the pair about what exactly had happened on that fateful day. Carolynne was the first to share her story. She told the police about the masked man who abducted and drove her to the national park. As she lay naked on the ground, gagged and bound, and breathlessly praying to be saved, the masked stranger who was digging a hole a few feet away suddenly stopped. Carolynne's position made it impossible to see what was going on, but she heard footsteps fading away. She soon realized that her captor had walked away, leaving her alone. Seizing this chance, she tried to forcefully wriggle her hands and legs against the restraints, but her attempts proved fruitless. She kept struggling, hoping to find a way out. Finally, after a few minutes, she heard a voice that comforted her, and relief rushed in. It was the voice of her soulmate, Julian, frantically calling her name. He was also stark naked like Carolynne, but he'd managed to grab the abductor's knife and escape. He quickly cut open her restraints, and the couple fled deeper into the woods for safety. Then it was Julian's turn to share his story. He told police about the animal carcass on the road and how he'd stopped to examine it, leaving Carolynne behind. But the whole thing had been a setup to lure him farther away from his partner so that the kidnapper could attack each of them separately. When Julian bent down to examine the carcass, he heard quick footsteps behind him. Before he could turn, something heavy struck his head so hard that he was knocked out. When he regained consciousness a couple of hours later, he found himself tied up and naked in an unfamiliar forest with no sign of his attacker anywhere. He told the police that he somehow wriggled his way out of his restraints miraculously, and also found the knife nearby that was used to cut off his and Carolynne's clothing. He found Carolynne a few feet away and quickly freed her too. The pair immediately fled the scene before their kidnapper could return. However, before running off, they made sure to grab a sleeping bag and some food supplies that their attacker had seemingly left behind. Carolynne told investigators how hard it was for them to roam around the forest naked and helpless, with limited food supplies and the dangers always lurking around them. The temperature wasn't in their favor either. It would be scorching hot during the day, but quite chilly at night. The couple was constantly afraid of being discovered by their abductor. One moment in particular made their blood run cold when they accidentally ended up at the very place where they'd been held captive. Despite being scared out of their minds, Julian had managed to grab some clothes, another sleeping bag, and some food that the attacker had left behind. They continued to roam around lost and semi-dressed in the woods till they came upon the road and encountered the farmer. The police were puzzled about why the kidnapper had left sleeping bags and food behind. They decided to examine the spot in the national park where the couple were held captive. After an extensive search, they found a shovel, duct tape, ropes, and fragments of clothing. Investigators sent these items for a fingerprint test, and the results were chilling. The investigators were not expecting the person responsible for Carolynne's abduction would be the one she trusted and loved the most, since the only fingerprints on the shovel belonged to none other than Julian Buchwald himself. The investigators were not really convinced by Julian's story due to many inconsistencies in his narrative. The first hint of suspicion came when the police examined the place where Julian claimed he'd been hit on his head by the masked attacker. The police could see no signs suggesting an assault, not even footsteps or any traces of blood. The second hint of suspicion rose when the couple told the investigators that they were able to make a lucky escape because the attacker left them unsupervised and also left some food and the knife behind. Even more unbelievable was how the couple had stumbled back to the same location days later, miraculously finding more food and clothes to steal. These suspicions were only cemented when Julian's fingerprints were found on the shovel. The police immediately took Julian into custody and began a thorough interrogation. The young man, just 22 years old, pressured by the questioning, finally cracked and started to narrate the real story of what had happened on March 4th, 2008. The truth he revealed was shocking. The whole saga was a staged kidnapping planned and executed by Julian himself. Julian Buchwald claimed that he was the one who dressed up as the black-hooded attacker. The animal carcass was a planned distraction so he could walk away from Carolynne, change his clothes, and abduct her later. He'd carried the shovel in the boot of his car so he could bury all the evidence and leave no room for suspicion. When Carolynne had heard the attacker digging near her, it was actually Julian who was hiding the black clothes and balaclava he'd worn while staging the abduction. Then he had cut his own clothes, the ones he'd been wearing when they left home for the picnic. He'd also parked his car deep in the woods so that they wouldn't be able to retrieve it later and escape. Julian made sure to leave some supplies on the ground, which they could later steal from the so-called attacker. One thing he kept in mind was to leave no clothes behind, since this was the main reason he'd abducted his girlfriend. When Julian explained his motive, police were left baffled by his reasoning. Julian wanted to marry Carolynne immediately, but Carolynne wasn't ready and wanted to finish high school first. This enraged Julian because he was desperate to get intimate with her, but coming from a devout Christian background, any sort of physical relation before marriage was out of the picture. Thus, driven by his hormones, Julian had made this insane plan to sleep with his lover. According to Julian's statement, he deliberately left them both naked to create an atmosphere where Carolynne would be willing to sleep with him. He also knew that Carolynne would need some time and convincing to agree to his plans, so he used the pretext of being lost in the forest for days. He hoped that in the scary situation, Carolynne would be more willing to sleep with him as a last sign of their love, knowing that they might die any moment. So, while wandering in the woods, he'd brought up the subject many times, suggesting that if they die, they should leave this world married in the eyes of God. Later at night, he also suggested physical intimacy as a necessity to keep their bodies warm. Carolynne, however, stayed true to her beliefs and declined all of his suggestions. Julian then made a shocking revelation. He possessed a map of Alpine National Park that he hid along with his black clothes and other evidence inside the pit. This meant that Julian knew where they were the whole time and was only making Carolynne run around in circles to tire her so she'd finally submit to his wishes. When Julian realized that Carolynne wasn't going to give him what he wanted, he led her back to the area where they were held hostage and grabbed the clothes, finally leading her to the road and back home. Following Julian's confession, he was immediately arrested. This came as a shock to Carolynne, who never suspected his evil plans and had genuinely believed that someone wanted them both dead and was pursuing them in the woods. Julian Buchwald's trial was held in August 2009 at the Latrobe Valley County Court. The jury found him guilty of kidnapping his 17-year-old girlfriend, Carolynne Watson. Judge John Smallwood sentenced Buchwald to 7 years and 9 months in jail. However, on the day of his sentencing, Julian didn't appear in court. The county court in Melbourne heard that during his bail period, Julian had obtained a fake Indian passport and had flown to the city of Chennai on his day of sentencing. Desperate to escape punishment, Julian had dyed his hair black and tanned his skin to appear like an Indian. Though he managed to slip past the Australian airport, his striking blue eyes and fair skin beneath the tanning solution prevented him entering the Indian subcontinent. He was immediately deported out of India to Singapore, where Australian authorities were waiting to arrest him. Later, it was found that India was just a temporary stop for Julian and that his intended destination was Germany, where he had some relatives. Julian was brought back to Australia, where, in addition to his original sentence, he was given an additional 6 months in jail for attempting to flee while on bail. This case was a bizarre one that baffled a lot of people. Carolynne was badly shaken up by the whole experience and wasn't able to cope after learning the truth about her kidnapping. Julian's family was left shattered by the actions of their beloved son and prayed to God every day for forgiveness. A man's desire to satisfy his needs made him commit such a heinous crime on his own girlfriend that he was planning to marry in a few years. This case not only angered the people, but many were left feeling disgusted by the evil acts committed by Julian Buchwald. On January 2, 2000, an 18-year-old boy, Zane Webb Quinn, suddenly went missing after assuring his mother he'd be back from work after 9 p.m. Investigations revealed 2 suspects in the case, Jason Owens and Misty Taylor. However, there was no concrete evidence to tie either of them to Zebb's disappearance. Years later, a murder case will bring a sudden twist to crack this case open again for further scrutiny. Would the detectives finally unearth the truth behind Zebb's disappearance? Would they ever reunite Zebb with his family? Asheville is a town in the county seat of Buncombe County, North Carolina. Sitting at the confluence of the French Broad and Swannanoa rivers, it's the largest city in western North Carolina and the state's 11th most populous city. The community's witnessed a steady increase in population from close to 69,000 in the 2000s to over 94,000 in 2020. The small town's economy is significantly buoyant thanks to the headquarters of several major corporations situated there. These include Home Trust Bankshares, Ingalls, Earth, Fair, and several others. Asheville is also a tourist destination with a thriving arts and music scene. It houses the Biltmore Estate, America's largest home in history. Built over a century ago, Biltmore is a chateau-esque style mansion owned by George Washington Vanderbilt II. The sprawling estate occupies almost 179,000 square feet of floor space. Asheville has a crime rate of about 7.48 per thousand residents. Unfortunately, Zebb Quinn himself became a victim listed in these statistics. Zebb Quinn was born on May 12, 1981 in Asheville, North Carolina, to Denise Valakis, a neonatal nurse, and Jerry Quinn, a bartender. Zebb also had an older sister, Brandy Quinn, whom he adored. Denise and Jerry got divorced 2 years after Zebb's birth. Denise raised the 2 children on her own while their father was notably absent. Denise and her children were quite close-knit. Brandy followed in her mother's footsteps and became a nurse, while Zebb was generally regarded as a mama's boy. Zebb enjoyed playing sports and joined the Boy Scouts, but he never really had any close friends. His inability to fit in with peers might be connected to the fact that he had a learning disability, which made it difficult for him to catch up with them in reading and comprehension. In his time at Robertson High School in Asheville, he joined the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, where he found a sense of belonging and camaraderie with his teammates. His mother, Denise, had hoped this would lead to a military career. However, his path shifted when he took on an after-school job at Walmart, working in the electronics department at the Hendersonville Road branch in Asheville. Zebb loved the job and was so dedicated to it that he never called in sick. His supervisor, Patty, said he would call me every morning just to talk or to see if he'd gotten anything done as he was supposed to. He is just that kind of guy I'd want my daughter to marry. He could find camaraderie with his coworkers who also adored him because of his helpful nature. Zebb graduated high school in 1999, but continued living with his mother and working at Walmart. He also enrolled in a community college. His mother said Zebb rarely gave her any trouble, even as a young adult just gaining his independence. He'd always come back home early and let her know about his whereabouts. He was not much of a partier. He was very focused on his work and school. The only friction Zebb had with his mother was over a crush called Misty Taylor. Denise didn't approve of Misty, and neither did Zebb's other family and friends. Misty worked at Costa's Kitchen, a restaurant owned by Denise's fiancé, Costa. She was known to always complain about her boyfriend Wesley Smith for his abusive nature. However, she stayed with them, and they even had a baby together. When Zebb began getting closer to her, friends and family warned him against the relationship, but Zebb was too infatuated and kept talking to Misty. He was considering taking management training classes in order to get a better position at Walmart in the new year. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. The 18-year-old would neither see much of the new year or millennium, nor the bright future he was excited about. Just one day after the historic New Year, on January 2, 2000, Zebb and Denise parted ways from home, and Zebb headed for a shift. Zebb, after hugging his mother, promised he'd be home when he got off work at 9 p.m. By 9:30 p.m., Zebb was yet to return home. His mother paged him to ask if he'd want to get dinner. However, he didn't respond. As it was the new year, Denise assumed her son was caught up in the rush of the festive season and would have to work late. Hence, the silence from his end raised no alarms. Denise proceeded to have dinner with her fiancé, Costa, and they returned home later only to be met with an empty house just as they'd left it. Zebb had still not returned. Denise sent him another page and got no reply. She began to worry. Zebb never stayed late at work without informing her. He also always answered any time she paged. By 10:30 p.m., Denise proceeded to call Walmart to see if her son was still at work. She was informed that he clocked out shortly after his shift ended at 9 p.m. Denise began to ask around the neighborhood if anyone had seen or knew about her son's whereabouts, but nobody could give her the answer she needed. Throughout the night, she couldn't sleep. She continued to page Zebb. The next day, Denise contacted Misty, but she said she also didn't know where Zebb was. By the afternoon of January 3, 2000, Denise filed a missing persons report after all efforts to find her son proved futile. Detectives at the Asheville Police Department told the worried mother there wasn't much they could do, as Zebb was a legal adult and he'd likely just run off for a while. Denise returned home with a heavy heart, hoping to hear from her son soon. On January 4, 2000, 2 days after Zebb went missing, his supervisor, Patty, called Denise to tell her she'd just received a call. According to Patty, the caller said, "This is Zebb Quinn, and I'm calling to let you know I won't be at work today. I'm sick." Not only was this strange, as Zebb had never called in sick, but Patty was also close to Zebb and didn't recognize the voice at the other end of the line to be him. She then interrogated the caller about the exact department he worked in. The caller replied that he worked in electronics. She then followed up with another question, asking him the exact time he was meant to clock in that day. Then the line went silent as the caller had no answer. He hung up the phone. Patty immediately redialed the number that called her in a bid to get the location the person was calling from. She discovered it was a Volvo construction company. Denise called the investigators, who headed to the store to investigate. Zebb's co-workers were questioned, and they told the police that Zebb was friends with a certain Jason Owens, who worked at the Volvo construction company in the area. Friends also said they'd seen the two boys talking during Zebb's shift on the night of his disappearance. After Zebb clocked out, co-workers claimed they saw both of them leaving together, but in separate vehicles. Detectives then went to the Volvo construction company, where they met Owens at work. Owens admitted that he'd made the call to Patty, but that was because Zebb had called him that day to call in sick on his behalf at his Walmart job. In his statement, Owens claims he ran into Zebb at the store on the night of January 2, 2000, and Zebb had told him he wanted to get a new car. While his old car still ran pretty well, Zebb said he needed something newer and sportier. Owens then told him there's a Mitsubishi he saw at a dealership near Leicester and asked him to come with him to check it out. After Zebb clocked out of the work, they left Walmart together that night to make the purchase. Inquiries by detectives led them to a gas station along the route Owens claimed they took. At the gas station, there was CCTV footage of the two boys at approximately 9:15 p.m. purchasing drinks at a convenience store. CCTV footage along the route also showed that they both turned into Long Shoals Road after driving for a while. A few moments after the turn, Zebb suddenly began flashing his headlights in a bid to get Owens to pull over. When he did, Zebb told him he received a page and needed to make a call at the nearby payphone. On returning from the payphone about 10 to 15 minutes later, Owens said Zebb had turned frantic, saying he needed to cancel their initial plans and head somewhere. Zebb got into his car, still panicking, and rear-ended Owens' truck in the process of driving off. After apologizing to Owens and promising to pay for the damage, Zebb raced off into the night. 2 days later, on January 4th, Owens claimed he received a page from Zebb, who begged him to call in sick for him at the store, which he did. Detectives were suspicious of Owens from the statement he made. most especially because the route he claimed they took to the dealership didn't add up. Lester was northwest of the Walmart store, while Long Shoals Road, which they took, was south of the store. The police spoke with Owen's supervisor at Volvo Construction Company to further verify his claims. The supervisor said Owens had failed to clock in for a 6 a.m. shift on January 3, 2000. However, he called in sick, saying he'd been in a car accident at the Waffle House on Long Shoals Road and had a doctor's note to prove it. This was a new piece of information, which, interestingly, Owens had skipped from his statement. Hospital records showed that Owens had, indeed, been treated for fractured ribs and head injury that night. However, there was no report of any accident at the Waffle House. Owens's car also didn't seem to have suffered any significant damage. Detectives, while interviewing Zebb's family and friends, discovered that their attention was consistently being drawn to the concerning relationship between Zebb and Misty. Zebb had confided in friends about Misty's abusive boyfriend Wesley, who was excessively jealous and controlling. On one occasion, Zebb had told his supervisor that Wesley and his friends had been threatening his life, demanding that he stop talking to Misty. These threats didn't seem to faze Zebb, as he'd spent New Year's Eve speaking with Misty all night. However, that was the last time he heard from her. On the day of his disappearance, Zebb told his grandma that he was worried after not hearing from Misty for 2 days. He then called Misty and cut off the call in panic immediately after the first ring. He did this because he'd forgotten to obscure his number by using *67 to prevent Wesley from knowing he called. "I'm in very big trouble now," he told his grandma. The detectives interviewed Misty, and despite evidence to the contrary, Misty described her relationship with Zebb as mere acquaintance. She claimed she knew nothing of his disappearance, as she was at her parents' house on the night of January 2, 2000. Her boyfriend Wesley was also interrogated, and he claimed he too was at his girlfriend's Misty's family home that night. Phone records were also investigated, and police found that the page last received by Zebb was from the house of his paternal aunt, Ina Ustich. This was surprising because even though they were family members and lived in the same vicinity, Zebb and his aunt didn't have a close relationship and didn't regularly contact each other. On questioning, Ustich told police officers that she did not make the page. At the time the page was sent, Ina said she was having dinner at the house of a friend, Tamara Taylor. Tamara turned out to be the mother of Misty, and she was able to confirm that Ina, Misty, and Wesley had all been at her house that night of January 2, 2000. This didn't raise any suspicions. Not only because it was a small town where everyone knew each other, but it was also a festive period where family and friends came together to celebrate the holidays. Despite this corroboration, officers remained suspicious of Misty and Wesley, but there was no probable cause for arrest. Instead, they remained persons of interest in the case. However, Ina filed a police report after the questioning because, due to the investigation, she discovered that her house had been broken into. Curiously, no items were stolen in the burglary. However, some picture frames and other items had been displaced from their positions. This call remained a mystery, and the said intruder was never found. 4 days after Zebb's disappearance, on January 6, 2000, Denise Flakis received a phone call from a former classmate of her son who also happened to be a colleague at the Asheville Hospital. The classmate said that she had sighted Zebb's car, a Mazda Protege, at a barbecue restaurant very close to their place of work. Detectives were called to the scene and they began to examine the car. The headlights had been left on, possibly to draw attention to the vehicle by whomever parked it there. In addition to this, there were several other odd things about the car. A pair of lips between 2 exclamation marks was drawn on the car's rear windshield with lipstick. A black Labrador mixed puppy was found abandoned in the car. Other items found in the car included a plastic hotel keycard, several alcohol bottles, and a jacket that didn't belong to Zebb. Following the new leads, policemen searched the town for the exact hotel that owned the keycard, but couldn't find it. The dog's owner was also never found, and it was eventually adopted by one of the first responders. Forensic evidence gathered inside the car included fingerprints, blood samples, and strands of blonde-colored hair. However, this led to 0 leads as to who might have driven the car. According to Denise, she was sure that the person who had driven the car to the barbecue shop and possibly abducted Zebb knew him well enough to know both his mother, grandmother, and sister worked near the restaurant. With the missing posters of Zebb making rounds across the town, a couple finally called into the station with information. They claimed they'd seen Zebb's Mazda being driven in downtown Asheville sometime after his disappearance. They also produced a composite image of the driver they saw. The image had a face that bore a striking resemblance to Misty. This made investigators doubt her claim that she knew nothing of Zebb's disappearance. Notably, Misty also had blonde hair like the one found in the car. For months, Denise would lay awake at night wondering where her son was and what exactly had happened to him. She'd spend hours looking at and speaking with his pictures. Denise was also very angry at the community members who kept mum for so long. She suspected someone knew something, but was refusing to come out with the truth. On the anniversary of Zebb's disappearance, January 2, 2001, police announced that since they couldn't find any evidence of foul play, Zebb's case would be classified as a missing persons case. 12 years later, his case was featured on an episode of Investigative Discoveries in 2012. This led to several new tips, but none yielded a positive result in the search. Police by this time announced their belief that Zebb had been murdered and his killer might have had an accomplice. Detectives remained determined for years and kept investigating Owens as well as Misty and her abusive boyfriend Wesley. They searched ponds and the woods and took out cadaver dogs, but these efforts yielded no results. Denise also remained hopeful that someone who knew something about the case would at least leave an anonymous tip. It was not until 15 years later that some light would shine from the end of the tunnel. Following Zebb's disappearance, Owens began to fall into several problems with law enforcement. On October 29, 2002, 2 years after Zebb's disappearance, Owens attempted to escape a traffic stop. He exceeded speed limits, fired shots at the police, and ultimately crashed his truck into a mailbox. Owens faced charges of driving under the influence and assaulting a police officer with a firearm, among others. He served 5 years in prison, released in 2006. Subsequently, he was arrested on January 1, 2007 for habitual impaired driving. Although he was released, the following month, he faced charges of disorderly conduct under the influence and resisting a police officer. Owens got into several other cases afterward as he continued to lead a lawless life. 15 years after Zebb's disappearance, Owens still lived in Leicester, where he now worked as a handyman for the family of Christy Showen Codd and Joseph J.T. Codd. Christy was a famous chef who was a contestant on the 8th season of The Next Food Network Star. On March 15, 2015, Christy's father Bill called the police to request a welfare check on his daughter, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, and was meant to pay him a visit. She wasn't answering her calls, but sent him a text claiming that she and her husband were down with the flu. Police officers were able to gain access to the house and realized something bad had happened. The family's dogs were left unattended and had messed up the house. The Codds were also nowhere to be found. A missing persons investigation began promptly, as it was a celebrity case with mounting public concern. Police discovered that the last time Christy and her husband used their phones was 4 days before the welfare check. While police were still searching the Codds' home, they received a call from an eyewitness who reported that they'd seen a man dumping items in a private dumpster. Police arrived at the location, about 8 miles away from the Codds' home, and began their search. There, they found items from the Codds' home. Other eyewitnesses also told police officers that they'd seen the same man selling items that clearly belonged to the couple at a pawn shop and flea market. Descriptions from the eyewitnesses led them to arrest Owens on January 16, 2015, on charges of breaking and entering and larceny after the couple's belongings were, indeed, found in his possession. During his interrogation on the same day, Owens confessed to killing the couple, stating that he'd accidentally run them over with his truck on March 12, 2015. According to him, the truck had gotten stuck in a creek near the house, and the Codds were present to offer assistance. Unfortunately, he'd hit the accelerator too hard, and the Codds, who were standing in front of the vehicle, were plowed to their deaths. Already, Owens had a long list of run-ins with the law, and this additional trouble, he believed, might keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Due to this fear, he decided to get rid of the bodies. Owens said he carried J.T. Codd's body to his double-wide trailer where he burned it in a wood stove. The following day, he returned to the house where he'd previously laid Christy's body. He then dismembered the corpse in the shower, placed the remains in a plastic bag, and transported it to his trailer home where he also burned it over his wood stove. He claimed to have started selling their belongings to stage their deaths as a failed robbery. Additionally, he confessed to sending texts from Christy's phone to delay suspicion about their disappearance. Investigations later recovered the couple's remains in both the dumpster and Owens' double-wide trailer. This new development regarding Owens resurrected Zebb's case 15 years after his disappearance. Detectives in the earlier case obtained a search warrant on March 31, 2015 against Owens' property. Considering the way he'd disposed of the Cod's bodies, they began to suspect that he'd done the same with Zebb. For months, they searched his Leicester Royal property, hoping to find new leads. In June 2015, they announced that they discovered fabric, leather materials, and unknown hard fragments under a layer of concrete on Owens' property, indicating that something or someone had been buried there. An unknown white powder substance, several pieces of metal and concrete, and numerous plastic bags containing possibly pulverized lime or powdered mortar mix were also found during the search. The officers refused to confirm whether Zebb's remains were found on the property, stating that the investigation was still ongoing at the time. Owens' trial in the Cod's case was straightforward, as he had admitted to their murder. However, his claim that it was an accident was not believed by prosecutors, considering the way he treated the corpses of his employers. While prosecutors wanted to pursue the death penalty, Owens agreed to a plea deal and pleaded guilty to all of his crimes before the court. In 2017, he was sentenced to a minimum of 59.5 years and a maximum of 74.5 years in prison without the possibility of parole. A year after Owens' sentencing, detectives investigating Zebb's disappearance began another round of interrogation. Already serving possibly the rest of his years in prison, Owen quickly spoke the truth he'd kept hidden for over a decade. According to Owens, Zebb's disappearance was connected to his love triangle with Misty. Owens claimed his uncle, Walter Gene Owens, was hired by Misty's abusive boyfriend, Wesley, who was jealous of Zebb's relationship with her. Owens claimed that on the night of January 2, 2000, Zebb and himself had been lured by his uncle Gene to meet Misty at the Pisgah National Forest. Instead of meeting Misty, Gene awaited both men with his plan to kill Zebb. Gene executed this plan by shooting Zebb with a .22 rifle. To cover up the murder, Owens claimed his uncle made him assist in dismembering Zebb. According to him, they also burned the remains and disposed of the ashes in the woods near Owens Cove Road and Bent Creek. A search was conducted in the area, but with several years of weathering, the chances of finding anything were next to nothing. Unfortunately, Walter Owens had also died in 2017 and couldn't corroborate Owens' story. While investigators never found any remains or evidence to corroborate Owens' statement, his confession was enough for a trial on the case. Again, Owens agreed to a plea deal and admitted to being an accessory to the murder of Zebb. While his trial was delayed for several issues, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, on July 25, 2022, Owens pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of accessory after the fact to first-degree murder. He was promptly sentenced to 12.5 to 15 3/4 years in prison to be served concurrently with a sentence for the Cod's murder. The sentence served to Owens didn't satisfy the public, especially Asheville residents with close ties to the case. However, the district attorney explained that the plea deal was the only viable option to secure a conviction against Owens. Despite the abundance of circumstantial evidence, there was no concrete proof linking Owens to Zebb's murder. In response to the conviction, Denise also admitted that the sentence could not justify the 22 years of heartache and unanswered questions. However, she expressed gratitude that Owens was already going to spend the rest of his life in prison. While the case of Zebb might have reached a conclusion legally, there are still several questions regarding how this conclusion was reached. Could it be that Owens was lying just to prevent a further investigation that might reveal concrete evidence nailing him as Zebb's murderer? Also, was this sentence adequate, considering his history of crimes? Whatever the truth is, Owens can finally pay for his mindless crimes, which have torn not just one, but 3 different families apart. We want to hear your thoughts, so please share them with us. If you have a case you'd like us to talk about, please indicate them in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting true